everybody, and welcome back to my reading of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. Today we are on Chapter 8, and I have two very special guests, one new and one returning. Please say hello to my returning guest, Sarah.
Hi! Excited to be here. I will be playing the part of Filchs.
Excellent. And my really good friend, Emma, who is joining us for the first time.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma and I will be playing Ron Weasley today.
Excellent. Are you two ladies ready to begin?
Sure, yeah.
All right, let's get started. Chapter 8, The Death Day Party. October arrived, spreading a damp chill over the grounds and into the castle. Madame Pomfrey, the nurse, was kept busy by a sudden spate of colds among the staff and students. Her pepper-up potion worked instantly, though it left the drinker smoking in the ears for several hours afterward. Ginny Weasley, who had been looking pale, was bullied into taking some by Percy. The steam pouring from under her vivid hair gave the impression that her whole head was on fire. Raindrops the size of bullets thundered on the castle windows for days on end. The lake rose, the flower beds turned into muddy streams, and Hagrid's pumpkins swelled to the size of garden sheds. Oliver Wood's enthusiasm for regular training sessions, however, was not dampened, which was why Harry was to be found, late one stormy Saturday afternoon, a few days before Halloween, returning to Gryffindor Tower, drenched to the skin and splattered with mud. Even aside from the rain and wind, it hadn't been a happy practice session. Fred and George, who had been spying on the Slytherin team, had seen for themselves the speed of those new Nimbus 2001s. They reported that the Slytherin team was no more than 7 greenish blurs shooting through the air like missiles. As Harry squelched along the deserted corridor, he came across somebody who looked just as preoccupied as he was. Nearly headless Nick, the ghost of Gryffindor Tower, was staring morosely out of a window, muttering under his breath, "Don't fulfill their requirements. Half an inch, if that." "Hello, Nick," said Harry. Hello, said nearly headless Nick, starting and looking round. He wore a dashing plumed hat on his long curly hair and a tunic with a ruff, which concealed the fact that his neck was almost completely severed. He was pale as smoke, and Harry could see right through him to the dark sky and torrential rain outside. "You look troubled, young Potter," said Nick, folding a transparent letter as he spoke and tucking it inside his doublet. "So do you," said Harry. "Ah." Nearly headless Nick waved an elegant hand. "A matter of no importance. It's not as though I really wanted to join. Thought I'd apply, but apparently I don't fulfill requirements." In spite of his airy tone, there was a look of great bitterness on his face. "But you wouldn't think, wouldn't you?" he erupted suddenly, pulling the letter back out of his pocket. "That getting hit 45 times in the neck with a blunt axe would qualify you to join the Headless Hunt?" "Oh, yes," said Harry, who was obviously supposed to agree. "I mean, nobody wishes more than I do that it had all been quick and clean and my head had come off properly. I mean, it would have saved me a great deal of pain and ridicule. However," nearly headless Nick shook his letter open and read furiously, "we can only accept huntsmen whose heads have parted company with their bodies. You will appreciate that it would be impossible otherwise for members to participate in hunt activities such as horseback head juggling and head polo. It is with great regret, therefore, that I must inform you that you do not fulfill our requirements. With very best wishes, Sir Patrick Delaney Podmore." Fuming, nearly headless Nick stuffed the letter away. "Half an inch of skin and sinew holding my neck on, Harry. Most people would think that's good and beheaded, but oh no, it's not enough for Sir properly decapitated Podmore." Nearly headless Nick took several deep breaths and then said, in a far calmer tone, "So, what's bothering you? Anything I can do?" "No," said Harry. "Not unless you know where we can get 7 free Nimbus 2001s for our match against the rest of Harry's sentence was drowned out by a high-pitched mewling from somewhere near his ankles. He looked down and found himself gazing into a pair of lamp-like yellow eyes. It was Mrs. Norris, the skeletal gray cat who was used by the caretaker, Argus Filch, as sort of deputy in his endless battle against students. "You'd better get out of here, Harry," said Nick quickly. "Filch isn't in a good mood. He's got the flu, and some third years accidentally plastered frog brains all over the ceiling in Dungeon 5. He's been cleaning all morning, and if he sees you dripping mud all over the place..." "Right," said Harry, backing away from the accusing stare of Mrs. Norris, but not quickly enough. Drawn to the spot by the mysterious power that seemed to connect him with a foul cat, Argus Filch burst suddenly through a tapestry to Harry's right, wheezing and looking wildly around for the rule breaker. There was a thick tartan scarf bound around his head, and his nose was unusually purple.
"Filth!"
he shouted, his jowls a-quiver, his eyes popping alarmingly as he pointed at the muddy puddle that had dripped from Harry's Quidditch robes.
"Mess and muck everywhere! I've had enough of it, I tell you! Follow me, Potter!"
So Harry waved a gloomy goodbye to nearly headless Nick and followed Filch back downstairs, doubling the number of muddy footprints on the floor. Harry had never been inside Filch's office before. It was a place most students avoided. The room was dingy and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp dangling from the low ceiling. A faint smell of fried fish lingered about the place. Wooden filing cabinets stood around the walls. From their labels, Harry could see that they contained details of every pupil Filch had ever punished. Fred and George Weasley had an entire drawer to themselves. A highly polished collection of chains and manacles hung on the wall behind Filch's desk. It was common knowledge that he was always begging Dumbledore to let him suspend students by their ankles from the ceiling. Filch grabbed a quill from a pot on his desk and began shuffling around, looking for parchment.
"Dung,
He muttered furiously.
great sizzling dragon bogies, frog brains, rat intestines. I've had enough of it. Make an example. Where's the form? Yes."
He retrieved a large roll of parchment from his desk drawer and stretched it out in front of him, dipping his long black quill into the ink pot.
"Name, Harry Potter. Crime,
"It was only a bit of mud," said Harry.
it's only a bit of mud to you, boy, but to me it's an extra hour scrubbing."
Shouted Filch, a drip shivering unpleasantly at the end of his bulbous nose.
"Crime, befouling castle, suggested sentence."
Dabbing at his streaming nose, Filch squinted unpleasantly at Harry, who waited with bated breath for his sentence to fall. But as Filch lowered his quill, there was a great bang on the ceiling of the office, which made the oil lamp rattle.
"Peeves!"
Filch roared, flinging down his quill in a transport of rage.
"I'll have you this time, I'll have you!"
And without a backward glance at Harry, Filch ran, flat-footed from the office, Mrs. Norris streaking alongside him. Peeves was the school poltergeist, a grinning, airborne menace who lived to cause havoc and distress. Harry didn't much like Peeves, but couldn't help feeling grateful for his timing. Hopefully, whatever Peeves had done, and it sounded as though he'd wrecked something very big this time, would distract Filch from Harry. Thinking that he should probably wait for Filch to come back, Harry sank into a moth-eaten chair next to the desk. There was only one thing on it apart from his half-completed form: a large, glossy purple envelope with silver lettering on the front. With a quick glance at the door to check that Filch wasn't on his way back, Harry picked up the envelope and read, "Quick Spell, a correspondence course in beginner's magic." Intrigued, Harry flicked the envelope open and pulled out the sheaf of parchment inside. More curly silver writing on the front page said, "Feel out of step in the world of modern magic? Find yourself making excuses not to perform simple spells? Ever been taunted for your woeful wand work? There's an answer. Quick Spell is an all-new, fail-safe, quick result, easy learn course. Hundreds of witches and wizards have benefited from the Quick Spell method. Madam Z. Nettles of Topsham writes, I had no memory for incantations, and my potions were a family joke. Now, after Quickspell course, I am the center of attention at parties, and friends beg for the recipe of my Centillion solution. Warlock DJ Prod of Didsbury says, my wife used to sneer at my feeble charms, but 1 month into our fabulous Quickspell course, and I succeeded in turning her into a yak. Thank you, Quickspell. Fascinated, Harry thumbed through the rest of the envelope's contents. Why on earth did Filch want a Quickspell course? Did this mean he wasn't a proper wizard? Harry was just reading Lesson 1, Holding Your Wand, some useful tips, when shuffling footsteps outside told him Filch was coming back. Stuffing the parchment back into the envelope, Harry threw it back onto the desk just as the door opened. Filch was looking triumphant.
That vanishing cabinet was extremely valuable,
he was saying gleefully to Mrs. Norris.
We'll have Peeves out this time, my sweet.
His eyes fell on Harry and then darted to the Quickspell envelope, which, Harry realized too late, was lying 2 feet away from where it had started. Filch's pasty face went brick red. Harry braced himself for a tidal wave of fury. Filch hobbled back to his desk, snatched up the envelope, and threw it into a drawer.
Did you read?
He sputtered. No, Harry lied quickly. Filch's knobbly hands were twisting together.
If I thought you'd read my private, not that it's mine, for a friend, be that as it may, however...
Harry was staring at him, alarmed. Filch had never looked madder. His eyes were popping. A tick was going in one of his pouchy cheeks, and the tartan scarf didn't help.
Very well, go. And don't breathe a word, not that. However, if you didn't read, go now. I have to write a Peeves report. Go.
Amazed at his luck, Harry sped out of the office, up the corridor, and back upstairs. To escape from Filch's office without punishment was probably some kind of school record. Harry! Did it work? Nearly Headless Nick came gliding out of a classroom. Behind him, Harry could see the wreckage of a large black and gold cabinet that appeared to have been dropped from a great height. I persuaded Peeves to crash it right over Filch's office, said Nick eagerly. Thought it might distract him. Was that you? Said Harry gratefully. Yeah, it worked. I didn't even get detention. Thanks, Nick. They set off up the corridor together. Nearly Headless Nick, Harry noticed, was still holding Sir Patrick's rejection letter. I wish there was something I could do for you about the Headless Hunt, Harry said. Nearly Headless Nick stopped in his tracks, and Harry walked right through him. He wished he hadn't. It was like stepping through an icy shower. But there is something you can do for me, said Nick excitedly. Harry! Would I be asking too much? But no, you wouldn't want to. What is it? Said Harry. Well, this Halloween will be my 500th death day, said Nearly Headless Nick, drawing himself up and looking dignified. Oh, said Harry, not sure whether he should look sorry or happy about this. Right. I'm holding a party down in one of the roomier dungeons. Friends will be coming from all over the country. It would be such an honor if you would attend. Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger would be most welcome too, of course, but I dare say you'd rather go to the school feast. He watched Harry on tenterhooks. No, said Harry quickly. I'll come. My dear boy, Harry Potter, at my death day party, and... He hesitated, looking excited. Do you think you could possibly mention to Sir Patrick how very frightening and impressive you find me? Of course, said Harry. Nearly Headless Nick beamed at him. A death day party, said Hermione keenly, when Harry had changed at last and joined her and Ron in the common room. I bet there aren't many living people who can say they've been to one of those. It'll be fascinating.
Why would anyone want to celebrate the day they died?
Said Ron, who was halfway through his potions homework and grumpy.
Sounds dead depressing to me.
Rain was still lashing the windows, which was now inky black, but inside all looked bright and cheerful. The firelight glowed over the countless squashy armchairs where people sat reading, talking, doing homework, or, in the case of Fred and George Weasley, trying to find out what would happen if you fed a filibuster firework to a salamander. Fred had rescued the brilliant orange fire-dwelling lizard from a Care of Magical Creatures class, and it was now smoldering gently on a table surrounded by a knot of curious people. Harry was at the point of telling Ron and Hermione about Filch and the Quickspell course when the salamander suddenly whizzed into the air, emitting loud sparks and bangs as it whirled wildly around the room. The sight of Percy bellowing himself hoarse at Fred and George, the spectacular display of tangerine stars showering from the salamander's mouth, and its escape into the fire with accompanying explosions drove both Filch and the Quickspell in envelope from Harry's mind. By the time Halloween arrived, Harry was regretting his rash promise to go to the Death Day party. The rest of the school was happily anticipating their Halloween feast. The Great Hall had been decorated with the usual live bats. Hagrid's vast pumpkins had been carved into lanterns large enough for 3 men to sit in, and there were rumors that Dumbledore had booked a troupe of dancing skeletons for the entertainment. "A promise is a promise," Harry reminded Harry bossily. "You said you'd go to the Death Day party." So at 7 o'clock, Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked straight past the doorway to the packed Great Hall, which was glittering invitingly with gold plates and candles, and redirected their steps instead toward the dungeons. The passageway leading to nearly Headless Nick's party had been lined with candles too, though the effect was far from cheerful. These were long, thin, jet-black tapers, all burning bright blue, casting a dim, ghostly light even over their own living faces. The temperature dropped with every step they took. As Harry shivered and drew his robes tightly around him, he heard what sounded like 1,000 fingernails scraping an enormous blackboard.
Is that supposed to be music?
Ron whispered. They turned a corner and saw nearly Headless Nick standing at a doorway hung with black velvet drapes. "My dear friends," he said mournfully, "welcome, welcome. So pleased you could come." He swept off his plumed hat and bowed them inside. It was an incredible sight. The dungeon was full of hundreds of pearly white, translucent people, mostly drifting around a crowded dance floor, waltzing to the dreadful, quavering sound of 30 musical saws, played by an orchestra on a raised, black-draped platform. A chandelier overhead blazed midnight blue with 1,000 more black candles. Their breath rose in a mist before them. It was like stepping into a freezer. "Shall we have a look around?" Harry suggested, wanting to warm up his feet.
Careful not to walk through anyone,
said Ron nervously, and they set off around the edge of the dance floor. They passed a group of gloomy nuns, a ragged man wearing chains, and the fat friar, a cheerful Hufflepuff ghost who was talking to a knight with an arrow sticking out of his forehead. Harry wasn't surprised to see that the Bloody Baron, a gaunt, staring Slytherin ghost covered in silver bloodstains, was being given a wide berth by the other ghosts. "Oh no," said Hermione, stopping abruptly. Turn back! I don't want to talk to Moaning Myrtle." "Who?" said Harry as they backtracked quickly. "She haunts one of the toilets in the girls' bathroom on the first floor," said Hermione. "She haunts a toilet?" "Yes, it's been out of order all year because she keeps having tantrums and flooding the place. I never went in there anyway if I could avoid it. It's awful trying to have a pee with her wailing at you," said Ron. On the other side of the dungeon was a long table, also covered in black velvet. They approached it eagerly, but next moment had stopped in their tracks, horrified. The smell was quite disgusting. Large, rotten fish were laid on handsome silver platters. Cakes, burnt charcoal black, were heaped on salvers. There was a great maggoty haggis, a slab of cheese covered in furry green mold, and, in pride of place, an enormous great cake in the shape of a tombstone, with tar-like icing forming the words, "Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, died 31st October, 1492. Harry watched, amazed, as the portly ghost approached the table, crouched low, and walked through, his mouth held wide so that it passed through one of the stinking salmon. "Can you taste it if you walk through it?" Harry asked him. "Almost," said the ghost sadly, and he drifted away. I expect they've let it rot to give it a stronger flavor, said Hermione, knowledgeably, pinching her nose and leaning closer to look at the putrid haggis.
Sick,
said Ron. They had barely turned around, however, when a little man swooped suddenly from under the table and came to a halt in mid-air before them. Hello, Peeves, said Harry, cautiously. Unlike the ghosts around them, Peeves the poltergeist was the very reverse of pale and transparent. He was wearing a bright orange party hat, a revolving bow tie, and a broad grin on his wide, wicked face. Nibbles? He said sweetly, offering them a bowl of peanuts covered in fungus. No thanks, said Hermione. Heard you talking about poor Myrtle, said Peeves, his eyes dancing. Rude, you were talking about poor Myrtle. He took a deep breath and bellowed, Oi! Myrtle! Oh no, Peeves, don't tell her what I said. She'll be really upset, Hermione whispered frantically. I didn't mean it. I don't mind her. Hello, Myrtle. The squat ghost of a girl had glided over. She had the glummest face Harry had ever seen, half hidden behind lank hair and thick, pearly spectacles. What? She said sulkily. How are you, Myrtle? Said Hermione in a falsely bright voice. It's nice to see you out of the toilet. Myrtle sniffed. Miss Granger was just talking about you, said Peeves slyly in Myrtle's ear. Just saying how nice you look tonight, said Hermione, glaring at Peeves. Myrtle eyed Hermione suspiciously. You're making fun of me, she said, silver tears welling rapidly in her small, see-through eyes. No, honestly, didn't I just say how nice Myrtle's looking? Said Hermione, nudging Harry and Ron painfully in the ribs.
Oh yeah.
She did. Don't lie to me, Myrtle gasped, tears now flooding down her face, while Peeves chuckled happily over her shoulder. Do you think I would know if people call me behind my back? Fat Myrtle, ugly Myrtle, miserable moaning, moping Myrtle. You've forgotten Pimply, Peeves hissed in her ear. Moaning Myrtle burst into anguished sobs and fled from the dungeon. Peeves shot after her, pelting her with moldy peanuts, yelling, Pimply, Pimply! Oh dear, said Hermione sadly. Nearly headless Nick now drifted toward them through the crowd. Enjoying yourselves? Oh yes, they lied. Not a bad turnout, said nearly headless Nick proudly. The Wailing Widow came all the way up from Kent. It's nearly time for my speech. I'd better go and warn the orchestra. The orchestra, however, stopped playing at that very moment. They and everyone else in the dungeon fell silent, looking around in excitement as a hunting horn sounded. Oh, here we go, said nearly headless Nick bitterly. Through the dungeon wall burst a dozen ghost horses, each ridden by a headless horseman. The assembly clapped wildly. Harry started to clap too, but stopped quickly at the sight of Nick's face. The horses galloped into the middle of the dance floor and halted, rearing and plunging. At the front of the pack was a large ghost who held his bearded head under his arm, from which position he was blowing the horn. The ghost leapt down, lifted his head high in the air so he could see everyone over the crowd. Everyone laughed, and strode over to nearly headless Nick, squashing his head back onto his neck.
Hey, Mom.
Nick! He roared. How are you? Still hanging in there? He gave a hearty guffaw and clapped nearly headless Nick on the shoulder. Welcome, Patrick, said Nick stiffly. Livens, said Sir Patrick, spotting Harry, Ron, and Hermione and giving a huge fake jump of astonishment so that his head fell off again. The crowd howled with laughter. Very amusing, said nearly headless Nick darkly. Don't mind Nick, shouted Sir Patrick's head from the floor. Still upset we won't let him join the hunt, but I mean to say, look at the fellow. I think, said Harry hurriedly, at a meaningful look from Nick. Nick's very frightening and, Ha! Yelled Sir Patrick's head. Bet he asked you to say that. If I could have everyone's attention, it's time for my speech, said nearly headless Nick loudly, striding toward the podium and climbing into an icy blue spotlight. My late lamented lords, ladies, and gentlemen, it is my great sorrow. But nobody heard much more. Sir Patrick and the rest of the Headless Hunt had just started a game of head hockey, and the crowd was turning to watch. Nearly Headless Nick tried vainly to recapture his audience, but gave up as Sir Patrick's head went sailing past him to loud cheers. Harry was very cold by now, not to mention hungry.
I can't stand much more of this,
Ron muttered, his teeth chattering as the orchestra ground back into action and the ghosts swept back onto the dance floor. Let's go, Harry agreed. They backed toward the door, nodding and beaming at anyone who looked at them, and a minute later were hurrying back up the passageway full of black candles.
Pudding might not be finished yet,
said Ron hopefully, leading the way toward the steps to the entrance hall. And then Harry heard it.
Kill.
It was the same voice, the same cold, murderous voice he had heard in Lockhart's office. He stumbled to a halt, clutching at the stone wall, listening with all his might, looking around, squinting up and down the dimly lit passageway. Harry, what are you? It's that voice again. Shut up a minute.
So hungry. It was so long.
Listen, said Harry urgently, and Ron and Hermione froze, watching him.
Kill. Time to kill.
The voice was growing fainter. Harry was sure it was moving away, moving upward. A mixture of fear and excitement gripped him as he stared at the dark ceiling. How could it be moving upward? Was it a phantom to whom stone ceilings didn't matter? This way, he shouted, and he began to run up the stairs into the entrance hall. It was no good hoping to hear anything here. The babble of talk from the Halloween feast was echoing out of the great hall. Harry sprinted up the marble staircase to the first floor, Ron and Hermione clattering behind him. Harry, what are we? Shh! Harry strained his ears. Distantly, from the floor above, and growing fainter still, he heard the voice.
I smell blood. I smell blood.
His stomach lurched. It's going to kill someone, he shouted, and ignoring Ron's and Hermione's bewildered faces, he ran up the next flight of steps 3 at a time, trying to listen over his own pounding footsteps. Harry hurtled around the whole of the second floor, Ron and Hermione panting behind him, not stopping until they turned a corner into the last deserted passage.
Harry, what was that all about?
Said Ron, wiping sweat off his face.
I couldn't hear anything.
But Hermione gave a sudden gasp, pointing down the corridor. Look! Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached slowly, squinting through the darkness. Foot-high words had been daubed on the walls behind 2 windows, shimmering in the light cast by the flaming torches. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware.
What's that thing hanging underneath?
Said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Harry almost slipped. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Ron and Hermione grabbed him and they inched toward the message, eyes fixed on a dark shadow beneath it. All 3 of them realized what it was at once and leapt backward with a splash. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was hanging by her tail from the torch bracket. She was stiff as a board, her eyes wide and staring. For a few seconds, they didn't move. Then Ron said,
Let's get out of here.
Shouldn't we try and help? Harry began awkwardly.
Trust me,
Said Ron.
We don't want to be found here.
But it was too late. A rumble, as though of distant thunder, told them that the feast had just ended. From either end of the corridor where they stood came the sound of hundreds of feet climbing the stairs and the loud, happy talk of well-fed people. Next moment, students were crashing into the passage from both ends. The chatter, the bustle, the noise died suddenly as the people in front spotted the hanging cat. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood alone, in the middle of the corridor as silence fell among the mass of students pressing forward to see the grisly sight. Then, someone shouted through the quiet, "Enemies of the air, beware! You'll be next, mudbloods!" It was Draco Malfoy. He had pushed to the front of the crowd, his cold eyes alive, his usually bloodless face flushed as he grinned at the sight of the hanging, immobile cat. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 8. I don't want to totally ruin it for everyone out there, but do not be concerned, Mrs. Norris is not dead. But you will have to hang in there for the remaining chapters to see what happened. So in the meantime, I would like to thank my special guests, Sarah and Emma, for being here. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
This was so fun, and I'm so glad, Sarah, you joined again, and Emma, I'm so glad you decided to do some awesome characters for your first time around. As for the rest of you, join me tomorrow for Chapter 9, and I will see you then. Happy reading! Hi everybody, and welcome back to my reading of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. We left off about to read Chapter 9, and today I have some very special guests all returning. Please say hello to Chris and Jess calling in from Buffalo, New York.
Cheers.
Hi.
Happy to have you guys back playing Ron and Hermione as usual. Fantastic. And of course my husband John, who will actually not be playing Hagrid today.
Hello.
Ready to get started, everyone?
Ready?
Yep, ready.
Perfect. Chapter 9, The Writing on the Wall. What's going on here? What's going on? Attracted no doubt by Malfoy's shout, Argus Filch came shouldering his way through the crowd. Then he saw Mrs. Norris and fell back, clutching his face in horror. My cat! My cat! What's happened to Mrs. Norris? He shrieked, and his popping eyes fell on Harry. You! He screeched. You! You've murdered my cat! You've killed her! I'll kill you!
Argus!
Dumbledore had arrived on the scene, followed by a number of other teachers. In seconds, he had swept past Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and detached Mrs. Norris from the torch bracket.
Come with me, Argus.
He said to Filch.
You too, Mr. Potter. Mr. Weasley. Miss Ranger.
Lockhart stepped forward eagerly. My office is nearest, Headmaster. Just upstairs. Please feel free,
Thank you, Gilderoy.
said Dumbledore. The silent crowd parted to let them pass. Lockhart, looking excited and important, hurried after Dumbledore. So did Professors McGonagall and Snape. As they entered Lockhart's darkened office, there was a flurry of movement across the walls. Harry saw several of the Lockharts in the pictures dodging out of sight, their hair in rollers. The real Lockhart lit the candles on his desk and stood back. Dumbledore laid Mrs. Norris on the polished surface and began to examine her. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged tense looks and sank into chairs outside the pool of candlelight, watching. The tip of Dumbledore's long, crooked nose was barely an inch from Mrs. Norris's fur. He was looking at her closely through his half-moon spectacles, his long fingers gently prodding and poking. Professor McGonagall was bent almost as close, her eyes narrowed. Snape loomed behind them, half in shadow, wearing a most peculiar expression. It was as though he was trying hard not to smile. And Lockhart was hovering around all of them, making suggestions. It was definitely a curse that killed her. Probably the transmogriffin torture. I've seen it used many times. So unlucky I wasn't there. I know the very counter curse that would have saved her. Lockhart's comments were punctuated by Filch's dry, racking sobs. He was slumped in a chair by the desk, unable to look at Mrs. Norris, his face in his hands. Much as he detested Filch, Harry couldn't help feeling a bit sorry for him, though not nearly as sorry as he felt for himself. If Dumbledore believed Filch, he would be expelled for sure. Dumbledore was now muttering strange words under his breath and tapping Mrs. Norris with his wand, but nothing happened. She continued to look as though she had been recently stuffed. "I remember something very similar happening in Ouagadougou," said Lockhart. "A series of attacks. The full story is in my autobiography. I was able to provide the townsfolk with various amulets, which cleared up the matter at once." The photographs of Lockhart on the walls were all nodding in agreement as he talked. One of them had forgotten to remove his hairnet. At last, Dumbledore straightened up.
"She's not dead, Argus,"
he said softly. Lockhart stopped abruptly in the middle of counting the number of murders he had prevented. "Not dead?" choked Filch, looking through his fingers at Mrs. Norris. Why is she all stiff and frozen?"
"She has been petrified,"
said Dumbledore. "Ah, I thought so," said Lockhart.
"But how? I cannot say."
"Ask him!" shrieked Filch, turning his blotched and tear-stained face to Harry.
"No second year could have done this,"
said Dumbledore firmly.
"It would take dark magic of the most advanced."
"He did it! He did it!" Filch spat, his pouchy face purpling. "You saw what he wrote on the wall. He found in my office. He knows I'm a... Filch's face worked horribly. "He knows I'm a squib!" he finished. "I never touched Mrs. Norris," Harry said loudly, uncomfortably aware of everyone looking at him, including all the Lockharts on the walls. "And I don't even know what a squib is." "Rubbish!" snarled Filch. "He saw my quick spell letter." "If I might speak, Headmaster," said Snape from the shadows, and Harry's sense of foreboding increased. He was sure nothing Snape had to say was going to do him any good. "Potter and his friends may have been simply in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, a slight sneer curling his mouth as though he doubted it. "But we do have a set of suspicious circumstances here. Why was he in the upstairs corridor at all? Why wasn't he at the Halloween feast?" Harry, Ron, and Hermione all launched into an explanation about the Death Day party. "There were hundreds of ghosts. They'll tell you we were there." "But why not join the feast afterward?" said Snape, his black eyes glittering in the candlelight. "Why go up to that corridor?" Ron and Hermione looked at Harry. Because, Harry said, his heart thumping very fast. Something had told him it would sound very far-fetched if he told them he had been led there by a bodiless voice. But he could hear, "Because we were tired and wanted to go to bed," he said. "Without any supper?" said Snape, a triumphant smile flickering across his gaunt face. "I didn't think ghosts provided food fit for living people at their parties."
We weren't hungry,
said Ron loudly as his stomach gave a huge rumble. Snape's nasty smile widened. "I suggest, Headmaster, that Potter is not being entirely truthful," he said. "It might be a good idea if he were deprived of certain privileges until he is ready to tell us the whole story. I personally feel he should be taken off the Gryffindor Quidditch team until he is ready to be honest." "Really, Severus," said Professor McGonagall sharply, "I see no reason to stop the boy playing Quidditch. This cat wasn't hit over the head with a broomstick. There is no evidence at all that Potter has done anything wrong." Dumbledore was giving Harry a searching look. His twinkling, light blue gaze made Harry feel as though he were being x-rayed.
"Innocent until proven guilty, Severus,"
he said firmly. Snape looked furious. So did Filch. "My cat has been petrified!" he shrieked, his eyes popping. "I want to see some punishment!"
"We will be able to cure her, Argus,"
said Dumbledore patiently.
"Professor Sprout recently managed to use some mandrakes. This As soon as they have reached their full size, I will have a potion made that will revive Mrs. Norris.
I'll make it, Lockhart butted in. I must have done it 100 times. I could whip up a mandrake restorative draught in my sleep. Excuse me, said Snape icily, but I believe I am the potions master at this school. There was a very awkward pause. Dumbledore said to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They went as quickly as they could without actually running. When they were a floor up from Lockhart's office, they turned into an empty classroom and closed the door quietly behind them. Harry squinted at his friends' darkened faces. Do you think I should have told them about that voice I heard?
No,
said Ron without hesitation.
hearing voices no one else can hear isn't a good sign, even in the wizarding world.
Something in Ron's voice made Harry ask, You do believe me, don't you?
Of course I do,
Said Ron quickly.
but you must admit it's weird.
I know it's weird, said Harry. The whole thing's weird. What was that writing on the wall about? The chamber has been opened. What's that supposed to mean?
You know, it rings a sort of bell.
Said Ron slowly.
I think someone told me a story about a secret chamber at Hogwarts once. Might have been Bill?
And what on earth's a squib? Said Harry. To his surprise, Ron stifled a snigger.
Well, it's not funny really, but as it's Filch,
He said.
Squib is someone who was born into a wizarding family but hasn't got any magic powers. Kind of the opposite of muggle-born wizards, but squibs are quite unusual. If Filch is trying to learn magic from a quick spell course, I reckon he must be a squib. It would explain a lot, like why he hates students so much.
Ron gave a satisfied smile.
He's bitter.
A clock chimed somewhere. Midnight, said Harry. We'd better get to bed before Snape comes along and tries to frame us for something else. For a few days, the school could talk of little else but the attack on Mrs. Norris. Filch kept it fresh in everyone's minds by pacing the spot where she had been attacked, as though he thought the attacker might come back. Harry had seen him scrubbing the message on the wall with Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover, but to no effect. The words still gleamed as brightly as ever on the stone. When Filch wasn't guarding the scene of the crime, he was skulking red-eyed through the corridors, lunging out at unusual suspects and trying to put them in detention for things like breathing loudly and looking happy. Ginny Weasley seemed very disturbed by Mrs. Norris's fate. According to Ron, she was a great cat lover.
But you haven't really got to know Mrs. Norris.
Ron told her bracingly.
Honestly, we're much better off without her.
Ginny's lip trembled.
Stuff like this doesn't happen often at Hogwarts.
Ron assured her.
They'll catch the maniac who did it and have him out of here in no time. I just hope he's got time to petrify Filch before he's expelled. I'm only joking.
Ron added hastily as Ginny blanched. The attack also had an effect on Hermione. It was quite usual for Hermione to spend a lot of time reading, but she was now doing almost nothing else. Nor could Harry and Ron get much response from her when they asked what she was up to, and not until the following Wednesday they find out. Harry had been held back in potions where Snape had made him stay behind to scrape tube worms off the desks. After a hurried lunch, he went upstairs to meet Ron in the library and saw Justin Finch Fletchley, the Hufflepuff boy from herbology, coming toward him. Harry had just opened his mouth to say hello when Justin caught sight of him, turned abruptly, and sped off in the opposite direction. Harry found Ron at the back of the library, measuring his history of magic homework. Professor Benz had asked for a 3-foot-long composition on the medieval assembly of European wizards.
I don't believe it. I'm still 8 inches short.
Said Ron furiously, letting go of his parchment, which sprang back into a roll.
And Hermione's done 4 feet 7 inches, and her writing's tiny.
Where is she? asked Harry, grabbing the tape measure and unrolling his own homework.
Somewhere over there,
said Ron, pointing along the shelves, looking for another book.
She's trying to read the whole library before Christmas.
Harry told Ron about Justin Finch Fletchley running away from him.
Don't know why you care. I thought he was a bit of an idiot,
said Ron, scribbling away, making his writing as large as possible.
All that junk about Lockhart being so great.
Hermione emerged from between the bookshelves. She looked irritable and at last seemed ready to talk to them.
All the copies of Hogwarts A History have been taken out,
she said, sitting down next to Harry and Ron.
And there's a 2-week waiting list. I wish I hadn't left my copy at home, but I couldn't fit it in my trunk with all the Lockhart books.
Why do you want it? Said Harry.
The same reason everyone else wants it.
Said Hermione.
To read up on the legend of the Chamber of Secrets.
What's that? Said Harry quickly.
That's just it. I can't remember,
said Hermione, biting her lip.
I can't find the story anywhere else.
Hermione, let me read your composition,
said Ron, desperately checking his watch.
No, I won't,
said Hermione, suddenly severe.
You've had 10 days to finish it.
I only need another 2 inches, come on.
The bell rang. Ron and Hermione led the way to History of Magic, bickering. History of Magic was the dullest subject on their schedule. Professor Binns, who taught it, was the only ghost teacher, and the most exciting thing that ever happened in his classes was his entering the room through the blackboard. Ancient and shriveled, many people said he hadn't noticed he was dead. He had simply got up to teach one day and left his body behind him in an armchair in front of the staff room fire. His routine had not varied in the slightest since. Today was as boring as ever. Professor Binns opened his notes and began to read in a flat drone like an old vacuum cleaner until nearly everyone in the class was in a deep stupor, occasionally coming to long enough to copy down a name or date, then falling asleep again. He had been speaking for half an hour when something happened that had never happened before. Hermione put up her hand. Professor Binns, glancing up in the middle of a deadly dull lecture on the International Warlock Convention of 1289, looked amazed. Miss,
Granger, Professor. I was wondering if you could tell us anything about the Chamber of Secrets,
said Hermione in a clear voice. Dean Thomas, who had been sitting with his mouth hanging open, gazing out of the window, jerked out of his trance. Lavender Brown's head came up off her arms, and Neville Longbottom's elbow slipped off his desk. Professor Binns blinked. My subject is History of Magic, he said in his dry, wheezy voice. I deal with facts, Miss Granger, not myths and legends. He cleared his throat with a small noise like chalk snapping and continued. In September of that year, a subcommittee of Sardinian sorcerers... He stuttered to a halt. Hermione's hand was waving in the air again. Miss Grant?
Please, sir, don't legends always have a basis in fact?
Professor Binns was looking at her in such amazement, Harry was sure no student had ever interrupted him before, alive or dead. Well, said Professor Binns slowly. Yes, one could argue that, I suppose. He peered at Hermione as though he had never seen a student properly before. However, the legend of which you speak is such a very sensational, even ludicrous tale. But the whole class was now hanging on Professor Binns' every word. He looked dimly at them all. Every face turned to his. Harry could tell he was completely thrown by such an unusual show of interest. Oh, very well, he said slowly. Let me see. The Chamber of Secrets. You all know, of course, that Hogwarts was founded over 1,000 years ago. The precise date is uncertain by the 4 greatest witches and wizards of the age. The 4 schoolhouses are named after them: Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. They built this castle together, far from prying Muggle eyes, for it was an age when magic was feared by common people, and witches and wizards suffered much persecution. He paused, gazed blearily around the room, and continued. For a few years, the founders worked in harmony together, seeking out youngsters who showed signs of magic and bringing them to the castle to be educated. But then disagreements sprang up between them. A rift began to grow between Slytherin and the others. Slytherin wished to be more selective about the students admitted to Hogwarts. He believed that magical learning should be kept within all magic families. He disliked taking students of Muggle parentage, believing them to be untrustworthy. After a while, there was a serious argument on the subject between Slytherin and Gryffindor, and Slytherin left the school. Professor Binns paused again, pursing his lips, looking like a wrinkled old tortoise.
I am Loki of Asgard.
Reliable historical sources tell us this much, he said, but these honest facts have been obscured by the fanciful legend of the Chamber of Secrets. The story goes that Slytherin had built a hidden chamber in the castle, of which the other founders knew nothing. Slytherin, according to the legend, sealed the Chamber of Secrets so that none would be able to open it until his own true heir arrived at the school. The heir alone would be able to unseal the Chamber of Secrets, unleash the horror within, and use it to purge the school of all who were unworthy to study magic. There was silence as he finished telling the story, but it wasn't the usual sleepy silence that filled Professor Binns' classes. There was unease in the air as everyone continued to watch him, hoping for more. Professor Binns looked faintly annoyed. The whole thing is arrant nonsense, of course, he said. Naturally, the school has been searched for evidence of such a chamber many times by the most learned witches and wizards. It does not exist, a tale told to frighten the gullible. Hermione's hand was back in the air.
Sir, what exactly do you mean by the horror within the chamber?
That it's believed to be some sort of monster, which the heir of Slytherin alone can control, said Professor Binns in his dry, reedy voice. The class exchanged nervous looks. I tell you, the thing does not exist, said Professor Binns, shuffling his notes. There is no chamber and no monster.
But sir, said Seamus Finnegan, if the chamber can only be opened by Slytherin's true heir, no one else would be able to find it, would they?
Nonsense, O'Flaherty, said Professor Binns in an aggravated tone. If a long succession of Hogwarts headmasters and headmistresses haven't found the thing.
But Professor, piped up Parvati Patel, you'd probably have to use dark magic to open it.
Just because a wizard doesn't use dark magic doesn't mean he can't, Miss Pennyfeather, snapped Professor Binns. I repeat, if the likes of Dumbledore...
But maybe you've got to be related to Slytherin so Dumbledore couldn't, began Dean Thomas, but Professor Binns had had enough.
That will do, he said sharply. It's a myth. It does not exist. There is not a shred of evidence that Slytherin ever built so much as a secret broom cupboard. I regret telling you such a foolish story. We will return, if you please, to history. Just solid, believable, verifiable fact. And within 5 minutes, the class had sunk back into its usual torpor.
I always knew Salazar Slytherin was a twisted old loony,
Ron told Harry and Hermione as they fought their way through the teeming corridors at the end of the lesson to drop off their bags before dinner.
But I never knew he started all this pureblood stuff. I wouldn't be in his house if you paid me. Honestly, if the Sorting Hat had tried to put me in Slytherin, I'd have gotten the train straight back home.
Hermione nodded fervently, but Harry didn't say anything. His stomach had just dropped unpleasantly. Harry had never told Ron and Hermione that the Sorting Hat had seriously considered putting him in Slytherin. He could remember, as though it was yesterday, the small voice that had spoken in his ear when he'd placed the hat on his head a year before. You could be great, you know. It's all here, in your head, and Slytherin could help you on the way to greatness, no doubt about that. But Harry, who had already heard of Slytherin House's reputation for turning out dark wizards, had thought desperately, not Slytherin. And the hat had said, oh well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor. As they were shunted along in the throng, Colin Creevey went past. Hiya, Harry! Hello, Colin, said Harry automatically. Harry, a boy in my class has been saying you're... But Colin was so small, he couldn't fight against the tide of people bearing him toward the great hall. They heard him squeak, see ya, Harry! And he was gone.
What's a boy in his class saying about you?
Hermione wondered. That I'm Slytherin's heir, I expect, said Harry, his stomach dropping another inch or so as he suddenly remembered the way Justin Finch Fletchley had run away from him at lunchtime.
People here will believe anything,
said Ron in disgust. The crowd thinned and they were able to climb the next staircase without difficulty.
Do you really think there's a Chamber of Secrets?
Ron asked Hermione.
I don't know,
she said, frowning.
Dumbledore couldn't cure Mrs. Norris, and that makes me think that whatever attacked her might not be, well, human.
As she spoke, they turned a corner and found themselves at the end of the very corridor where the attack had happened. They stopped and looked. The scene was just as it had been that night, except there was no stiff cat hanging from the torch bracket, and an empty chair stood against the wall, bearing the message, "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened."
That's where Filchs has been keeping guard,
Ron muttered. They looked at each other. The corridor was deserted. Can't hurt to have a poke around, said Harry, dropping his bag and getting to his hands and knees so that he could crawl along, searching for clues. Scorch marks, he said. Here and here.
Come and look at this,
said Hermione.
This is funny.
Harry got up and crossed to the window next to the message on the wall. Hermione was pointing at the topmost pane, where around 20 spiders were scuttling, apparently fighting to get through a small crack. A long silvery thread was dangling like a rope, as though they had all climbed it in their hurry to get outside.
Have you ever seen spiders act like that?
Said Hermione wonderingly. No, said Harry. Have you, Ron? Ron? He looked over his shoulder. Ron was standing well back and seemed to be fighting the impulse to run. What's up? Said Harry.
I don't like spiders,
said Ron tensely.
I never knew that,
said Hermione, looking at Ron in surprise.
You've used spiders in potions loads of times.
I don't mind them dead,
said Ron, who was carefully looking anywhere but at the window.
I just don't like the way they move.
Hermione giggled.
It's not funny,
said Ron fiercely.
If you must know, when I was 3, Fred turned my teddy bear into a great big filthy spider because I broke his toy broomstick. You wouldn't like them either if you'd been holding your bear and suddenly it had too many legs and...
He broke off, shuddering. Hermione was obviously still trying not to laugh. Feeling they had better get off the subject, Harry said, Remember all that water on the floor? Where did that come from? Someone's mopped it up.
It was about here,
said Ron, recovering himself to walk a few paces past Filch's chair and pointing.
Level with this floor. Door.
He reached for the brass doorknob, but suddenly withdrew his hand as though he'd been burned. What's the matter? Said Harry.
Can't go in there,
said Ron gruffly.
That's a girl's toilet.
Oh, Ron, there won't be anyone in there,
said Hermione, standing up and coming over.
That's moaning murder. Myrtle's place. Come on, let's have a look.
And ignoring the large, out of order sign, she opened the door. It was the gloomiest, most depressing bathroom Harry had ever set foot in. Under a large, cracked, and spotted mirror were a row of chipped sinks. The floor was damp and reflected the dull light given off by the stubs of a few candles burning low in their holders. The wooden doors to the stalls were flaking and scratched, and one of them was dangling off its hinges. Hermione put her fingers to her lips and set off toward the end stall. When she reached it, she said,
Hello, Myrtle. How are you?
Harry and Ron went to look. Moaning Myrtle was floating above the tank of the toilet, picking a spot on her chin.
This is a girl's bathroom.
She said, eyeing Ron and Harry suspiciously.
They're not girls.
No,
Hermione agreed.
I just wanted to show them how, nice it is in here.
She waved vaguely at the dirty old mirror and the damp floor. Ask her if she saw anything, Harry mouthed at Hermione.
What are you whispering?
Said Myrtle, staring at him. Nothing, said Harry quickly. We wanted to ask,
I wish people would stop talking behind my back.
said Myrtle in a voice choked with tears.
I do have feelings, you know, even if I am dead.
Myrtle, no one wants to upset you.
Said Hermione.
Harry only...
No one wants to upset me. That's a good one.
Howled Myrtle.
My life was nothing but misery at this place, and now people will come along ruining my death.
We wanted to ask you if you've seen anything funny lately.
Said Hermione quickly.
Because a cat was attacked right outside your front door on Halloween.
Did you see anyone near here that night? Said Harry.
I wasn't paying attention.
Said Myrtle dramatically.
Peeves upset me so much, I came in here and tried to kill myself. Then, of course, I remembered that I'm
Already dead?
Said Ron helpfully. Myrtle gave a tragic sob, rose up in the air, turned over, and dived headfirst into the toilet, splashing water all over them and vanishing from sight, although from the direction of her muffled sobs, she had come to rest somewhere in the U-bend. Harry and Ron stood with their mouths open, but Hermione shrugged warily and said,
Honestly, that was almost cheerful for Myrtle. Come on, let's go.
Harry had barely closed the door on Myrtle's gurgling sobs when a loud voice made all three of them jump. Run! Percy Weasley had stopped dead at the head of the stairs, prefect badge agleam, an expression of complete shock on his face. It's a girl's bathroom, he gasped. What were you?
Just having a look around.
Ron shrugged.
Clues, you know.
Percy swelled in a manner that reminded Harry forcefully of Mrs. Weasley. Get away from there, Percy said, striding toward them and starting to bustle them along, flapping his arms. Don't you care what this looks like? Coming back here while everyone's at dinner?
Why shouldn't we be here?
Said Ron hotly, stopping short and glaring at Percy.
Listen, we never laid a finger on that cat.
That's what I told Ginny, said Percy fiercely, but she still seems to think you're going to get expelled. I've never seen her so upset, crying her eyes out. You might think of her. All the first years are thoroughly overexcited by this business.
You don't care about Ginny.
Said Ron, whose ears were now reddening.
You're just worried I'm going to mess up your chances of being head boy.
5 points from Gryffindor, Percy said tersely, fingering his prefect badge. And I hope it teaches you a lesson. No more detective work, or I'll write to Mom. And he strode off, the back of his neck as red as Ron's ears. Harry, Ron, and Hermione chose seats as far as possible from Percy in the common room that night. Ron was still in a very bad temper and kept blotting his charms homework. When he reached absently for his wand to remove the smudges, it ignited the parchment. Fuming almost as much as his homework, Ron slammed the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, shut. To Harry's surprise, Hermione followed suit.
Who can it be, though?
She said in a quiet voice, as though continuing a conversation they had just been having.
Who'd want to frighten all the squibs and muggleborns out of Hogwarts?
Let's think.
Said Ron in mock puzzlement.
Who do we know who thinks muggleborns are scum?
He looked at Hermione. Hermione looked back, unconvinced.
If you're talking about Malfoy...
Of course I am,
said Ron.
You heard him. You will be next, Mudbloods. Come on, you've only got to look at his foul rat face to know it's him.
Malfoy, the heir of Slytherin?
Said Hermione skeptically. Look at his family, said Harry, closing his books too. The whole lot of them have been in Slytherin. He's always boasting about it. They could easily be Slytherin's descendants. His father's definitely evil enough.
They could have had the key to the Chamber of Secrets for centuries,
said Ron.
Handing it down, father to son.
Well,
said Hermione cautiously.
I suppose it's possible.
But how do we prove it? Said Harry darkly.
There might be a way,
said Hermione slowly, dropping her voice still further with a quick glance across the room at Percy.
Of course, it would be difficult. Dangerous, very dangerous. We'd be breaking about 50 school rules, I'd expect.
If in a month or so you feel like explaining, you will let us know, won't you?
Said Ron irritably.
All right,
said Hermione coldly.
What we need to do is to get inside the Slytherin common room and ask Malfoy a few questions without him realizing it's us.
No, that's impossible, Harry said as Ron laughed.
No, it's not,
said Hermione.
All we'd need would be some polyjuice potion.
What's that? Said Ron and Harry together.
Snape mentioned it in class a few weeks ago.
You think we've got nothing better to do in potions than listen to Snape?
Muttered Ron.
It transforms you into somebody else. Think about it. We can change into 3 of the Slytherins. No one would know it was us. Malfoy would probably tell us anything. He's probably boasting about it in the Slytherin common room right now. If only we could hear him.
This polyjuice stuff sounds a bit dodgy to me,
said Ron, frowning.
What if we were stuck looking like 3 of the Slytherins forever?
It wears off after a while,
said Hermione, waving her hand impatiently.
But getting hold of the recipe will be very difficult. Snape said it was in a book called Noste Potente Potions, and it's bound to be in the restricted section of the library.
There was only one way to get a book from the restricted section. You needed a signed note of permission from a teacher.
Hard to see why we want the book, really,
said Ron.
If we weren't going to try to make one of those potions.
I think,
said Hermione,
that if we made it sound as though we were just interested in the theory, we might stand a chance.
Oh, come on. No teacher's going to fall for that,
said Ron.
They'd have to be really thick.
And that is the end of Chapter 9, The Writing on the Wall. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much to Chris and Jess for again doing a fantastic job voicing Hermione and Ron.
Thanks, Mrs. Jones.
Pleasure's all ours.
And thank you so much to John for taking a break from Hagrid, doing a very nice Dumbledore, and a very dramatic Moaning Myrtle.
You're welcome. Thank you.
As for the rest of us, we will be continuing our reading tomorrow from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So, until then, Chapter 10 tomorrow. Happy reading. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my reading of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. We left off about to read Chapter 10. I wanted to welcome my 2 very special guests back for their reading. Please say hello to my friend Nick from Brooklyn, New York.
Hi everyone.
So excited for you to return, and also my friend Jorge living in Burbank, California.
Hi, I'll be reading today for George and Gilderoy Lockhart.
Perfect. Well, I am so excited to have you both back. You ready to get started?
Yes, of course.
All right, let's do so. Chapter 10, The Rogue Bludger. Since the disastrous episode of the Pixies, Professor Lockhart had not brought live creatures to class. Instead, he read passages from his books to them, and sometimes reenacted some of the more dramatic bits. He usually picked Harry to help him with these reconstructions. So far, Harry had been forced to play a simple Transylvanian villager whom Lockhart had cured of a babbling curse, a yeti with a head cold, and a vampire who had been unable to eat anything except lettuce since Lockhart had dealt with him. Harry was hauled to the front of the class during their very next Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, this time acting a werewolf. If he hadn't had a very good reason for keeping Lockhart in a good mood, he would have refused to do it.
Nice loud howl, Harry. Exactly. And then, if you'll believe it, I pounced. Like this, slammed him to the floor. Thus, with one hand, I managed to hold him down. With my other, I put my wand to his throat, and then screwed up my remaining strength and performed the immensely complex Amorphous charm. He let out a piteous moan. Go on, Harry. Higher than that. Good. The fur vanished, the fangs shrank, and he turned back into a man. Simple, yet effective. And another village will remember me forever as the hero who delivered them from the monthly terror of werewolf attacks.
The bell rang, and Lockhart got to his feet.
Homework. Compose a poem about my defeat of the Wagga Wagga werewolf. Sign copies of Magical Me to the author of the best one.
The class began to leave. Harry returned to the back of the room, where Ron and Hermione were waiting. Ready? Harry muttered. Wait till everyone's gone, said Hermione nervously. All right. She approached Lockhart's desk, a piece of paper clutched tightly in her hand, Harry and Ron right behind her. Professor Lockhart, Hermione stammered, I wanted to get this book out of the library, just for background reading. She held out the piece of paper, her hand shaking slightly. But the thing is, it's in the restricted section of the library, so I need a teacher to sign for it. I'm sure it would help me understand what you say in Gadding with Ghouls about slow-acting venoms.
Gadding with Ghouls,
said Lockhart, taking the note from Hermione and smiling widely at her.
You started with a K-pop
possibly my very favorite book.
And
You enjoyed it?
Oh yes, said Hermione eagerly. So clever, the way you trapped that last one with the tea strainer.
Uninterrupted.
Well, I'm sure no one will mind me giving the best student of the year a little extra help,
said Lockhart warmly, and he pulled out an enormous peacock quill.
Yes, nice, isn't it?
He said, misreading the revolted look on Ron's face.
I usually save it for book signings.
He scrawled an enormous loopy signature on the note and handed it back to Hermione.
So, Harry,
said Lockhart, while Hermione folded the note with fumbling fingers and slipped it into her bag.
Tomorrow's the first Quidditch match of the season, I believe. Gryffindor against Slytherin, is it not? I hear you're a useful player. I was a seeker, too. I was asked to try out for the national squad, but prefer to dedicate my life to the eradication of the dark forces. Still, if ever you feel the need for a little private training, don't hesitate to ask. Always happy to pass on my expertise to less able players.
Harry made an indistinct noise in his throat and then hurried off after Ron and Hermione. I don't believe it, he said as the three of them examined the signature on the note. He didn't even look at the book we wanted. That's because he's a brainless git, said Ron. But who cares? We've got what we needed. He's not a brainless git, said Hermione shrilly as they half ran toward the library. Just because he said you were the best student of the year. They dropped their voices as they entered the muffled stillness of the library. Madame Pince, the librarian, was a thin, irritable woman who looked like an underfed vulture. Most potente potions? She repeated suspiciously, trying to take the note from Hermione, but Hermione wouldn't let go. I was wondering if I could keep it, she said breathlessly. Oh, come on, said Ron, wrenching it from her grasp and thrusting it at Madame Pince. we'll get you another autograph. Lockhart will sign anything if it stands still long enough. Madam Pince held the note up to the light as though determined to detect a forgery, but it passed the test. She stopped away between the lofty shelves and returned several minutes later carrying a large and moldy-looking book. Hermione put it carefully into her bag and they left, trying not to walk too quickly or look too guilty. 5 minutes later, they were barricaded in Moaning Myrtle's out-of-order bathroom again. Hermione had overridden Ron's objections by pointing out that it was the last place anyone in their right minds would go, so they were guaranteed some privacy. Moaning Myrtle was crying noisily in her stall, but they were ignoring her, and she them. Hermione opened Moste Potente potions carefully, and the three of them bent over the damp, spotted pages. It was clear from a glance why it belonged to the restricted section. Some of the potions had effects almost too gruesome to think about, and there were some very unpleasant illustrations, which included a man who seemed to have been turned inside out and a witch sprouting several extra pairs of arms out of her head. "Here it is," said Hermione excitedly as she found the page headed "The Polyjuice Potion." It was decorated with drawings of people halfway through transforming into other people. Harry sincerely hoped the artist had imagined the look of intense pain on their faces. "This is one of the most complicated potions I've ever seen," said Hermione as she scanned the recipe. "Lacewing flies, leeches, fluxweed, and nutgrass," she murmured, running her fingers down the list of ingredients. "Well, they're easy enough. They're in the student store cupboard. We can help ourselves." "Oh, look! Powdered horn of a bicorn. Don't know where we'll be able to get that. Shredded skin of a boomslang? That'll be tricky too. And of course, a bit of whoever we want to change into." "Excuse me?" said Ron sharply. "What do you mean, a bit of whoever we're changing into? I'm drinking nothing with crab's toenails in it." Hermione continued as though she hadn't heard him. "We don't have to worry about that yet, though, because we add those bits last." Ron turned speechless to Harry, who had another worry. "Do you realize how much we're going to have to steal, Hermione? Shredded skin of a boomslang? That's definitely not in the student's cupboard. What are we going to do, break into Snape's private stores? I don't know if this is a good idea." Hermione shut the book with a snap. "Well, if you two are going to chicken out, fine," she said. There were bright pink patches on her cheeks and her eyes were brighter than usual. "I don't want to break rules, you know. I think threatening Muggleborns is far worse than brewing up a difficult potion. But if you don't want to find out if it's Malfoy, I'll go straight to Madam Pince now and hand the book back in." "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be persuading us to break rules," said Ron. "All right, we'll do it. But not toenails, okay?" "How long will it take to make, anyway?" said Harry as Hermione, looking happier, opened the book again. "Well, since the fluxweed has got to be picked at the full moon and the lacewings have got to be stewed for 21 days, I'd say it'd be ready in about a month if we can get all the ingredients." "A month?" said Ron. "Malfoy could have attacked half the Muggleborns in the school by then." But Hermione's eyes narrowed dangerously again, and he added swiftly, "But it's the best plan we've got, so full steam ahead, I say." However, while Hermione was checking that the coast was clear for them to leave the bathroom, Ron muttered to Harry, "It'll be a lot less hassle if you just knock Malfoy off his broom tomorrow." Harry woke early on Saturday morning and lay for a while thinking about the coming Quidditch match. He was nervous, mainly at the thought of what Wood would say if Gryffindor lost, but also at the idea of facing a team mounted on the fastest racing broom gold could buy. He had never wanted to beat Slytherin so badly. After half an hour of lying there with his insides churning, he got up, dressed, and went down to breakfast early, where he found the rest of the Gryffindor team huddled at the long, empty table, all looking uptight and not speaking much. As 11 o'clock approached, the whole school started to make its way down to the Quidditch stadium. It was a muggy sort of day, with a hint of thunder in the air. Ron and Hermione came hurrying over to wish Harry good luck as he entered the locker rooms. The team pulled on their scarlet Gryffindor robes, then sat down to listen to Wood's usual pre-match pep talk. "Slytherin has got better brooms than us," he began. "No point denying it. But we've got better people on our brooms. We've trained harder than they have. We've been flying in all weathers.
Too true,
muttered George Weasley.
I haven't been properly dry since August.
And we're going to make them rue the day they let that little bit of slime Malfoy buy his way onto their team. Chest heaving with emotion, Wood turned to Harry. It'll be down to you, Harry, to show them that a seeker has to have something more than a rich father. Get to that snitch before Malfoy or die trying, Harry, because we've got to win today. We've got to.
So, no pressure, Harry,
said Fred, winking at him. As they walked out onto the pitch, a roar of noise greeted them, mainly cheers, because Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff were anxious to see Slytherin beat. But the Slytherins in the crowd made their boos and hisses heard too. Madam Hooch, the Quidditch teacher, asked Flint and Wood to shake hands, which they did, giving each other threatening stares and gripping rather harder than was necessary. On my whistle, said Madam Hooch. 3, 2, 1. With a roar from the crowd to speed them upward, the 14 players rose toward the leaden sky. Harry flew higher than any of them, squinting around for the snitch. All right there, Scarhead, yelled Malfoy, shooting underneath him as though to show off the speed of his broom. Harry had no time to reply. At that very moment, a heavy black bludger came pelting toward him. He avoided it so narrowly that he felt it ruffle his hair as it passed.
Close one, Harry,
said George, streaking past him with his club in his hand, ready to knock the bludger back toward a Slytherin. Harry saw George give the bludger a powerful whack in the direction of Adrian Pusey, but the bludger changed direction in midair and shot straight for Harry again. Harry dropped quickly to avoid it, and George managed to hit it hard toward Malfoy. Once again, the bludger swerved like a boomerang and shot at Harry's head. Harry put on a burst of speed and zoomed toward the other end of the pitch. He could hear the bludger whistling along behind him. What was going on? Bludgers never concentrated on one player like this. It was their job to try and unseat as many people as possible. Fred Weasley was waiting for the bludger at the other end. Harry ducked as Fred swung at the bludger with all his might. The bludger was knocked off course.
Gotcha!
Fred yelled happily, but he was wrong. As though it was magnetically attracted to Harry, the bludger pelted after him once more, and Harry was forced to fly off at full speed. It had started to rain. Harry felt heavy drops fall onto his face, splattering onto his glasses. He didn't have a clue what was going on in the rest of the game until he heard Lee Jordan, who was commentating, say, "Slytherin lead! 60 points to 0! The Slytherin's superior brooms were clearly doing their jobs, and meanwhile, the mad bludger was doing all it could to knock Harry out of the air. Fred and George were now flying so close to him on either side that Harry could see nothing at all except their flailing arms and had no chance to look for the snitch, let alone catch it.
Someone's tampered with this bludger!
Fred grunted, swinging his bat with all his might at it as it launched a new attack on Harry.
We need time out,
said George, trying to signal to Wood and stop the bludger breaking Harry's nose at the same time. Wood had obviously got the message. Madam Hooch's whistle rang out and Harry, Fred, and George dived for the ground, still trying to avoid the mad bludger. What's going on? Said Wood, as the Gryffindor team huddled together while Slytherins in the crowd jeered. We're being flattened! Fred, George, where were you when that bludger stopped Angelina scoring?
We were 20 feet above her stopping the other bludger from murdering Harry, Oliver, said
George angrily.
Someone's fixed it. It won't leave Harry alone. It hasn't gone for anyone else all game. The Slytherins must have done something to it.
But the bludgers have been locked in Madam Hooch's office since our last practice, and there was nothing wrong with them then, said Wood anxiously. Madam Hooch was walking toward them. Over her shoulder, Harry could see the Slytherin team jeering and pointing in his direction. Listen, said Harry as she came nearer and nearer. With you two flying around me all the time, the only way I'm going to catch the snitch is if it flies up my sleeve. Go back to the rest of the team and let me deal with the rogue one.
Don't be sick,
said Fred.
It'll take your head off.
Wood was looking from Harry to the Weasleys. Oliver, this is insane, said Alicia Spinnet angrily. You can't let Harry deal with that thing on his own. Let's ask for an inquiry. If we stop now, we'll have to forfeit the match, said Harry, and we're not losing to Slytherin just because of a crazy bludger. Come on, Oliver, tell them to leave me alone.
This is all your fault,
George said angrily to Wood.
Get the snitch or die trying. What a stupid thing to tell him.
Madame Hooch had joined them. Ready to resume play? She asked Wood. Wood looked at the determined look on Harry's face. All right, he said. Fred, George, you heard Harry. Leave him alone. Let him deal with the bludger on his own. The rain was falling more heavily now. On Madame Hooch's whistle, Harry kicked hard into the air and heard the telltale whoosh of the bludger behind him. Higher and higher Harry climbed. He looped and swooped, spiraled, zigzagged, and rolled. Slightly dizzy, he nevertheless kept his eyes wide open. Rain was speckling his glasses and ran up his nostrils as he hung upside down, avoiding another fierce dive from the bludger. He could hear laughter from the crowd. He knew he must look very stupid, but the rogue bludger was heavy and couldn't change direction as quickly as Harry could. He began a kind of roller coaster ride around the edges of the stadium, squinting through the silver sheets of rain to the Gryffindor goalposts, where Adrian Pusey was trying to get past Wood. A whistling in Harry's ear told him that the bludger had just missed him again. He turned right over and sped in the opposite direction. Training for the ballet, Potter! Yelled Malfoy as Harry was forced to do a stupid kind of twirl in midair to dodge the bludger. And he fled, the bludger trailing a few feet behind him, and then, glaring back at Malfoy in hatred, he saw it. The golden snitch. It was hovering inches above Malfoy's left ear, and Malfoy, busy laughing at Harry, hadn't seen it. For an agonizing moment, Harry hung in midair, not daring to speed toward Malfoy in case he looked up and saw the snitch. Wham! He had stayed still a second too long. The bludger had hit him at last, smashed into his elbow, and Harry felt his arm break. Dimly, dazed by the searing pain in his arm, he slid sideways on his rain-drenched broom, one knee still crooked over it, his right arm dangling, useless, at his side. The bludger came pelting back for a second attack, this time aiming at his face. Harry swerved out of the way, one idea firmly lodged in his numb brain. Get to Malfoy. Through a haze of rain and pain, he dived for the shimmering, sneering face below him and saw its eyes widen with fear. Malfoy thought Harry was attacking him. What the? He gasped, careening out of Harry's way. Harry took his remaining hand off his broom and made a wild snatch. He felt his fingers close on the cold snitch, but was now only gripping the broom with his legs. And there was a yell from the crowd below as he headed straight for the ground, trying hard not to pass out. With a splattering thud, he hit the mud and rolled off his broom. His arm was hanging at a very strange angle. Riddled with pain, he heard, as though from a distance, a good deal of whistling and shouting. He focused on the snitch clutched in his good hand. He said vaguely, "We've won," and he fainted. He came around, rain falling in his face, still lying on the field with someone leaning over him. He saw a glitter of teeth. "Oh, no, not you," he moaned.
Doesn't know what he's saying,
said Lockhart loudly to the anxious crowd of Gryffindors pressing around them.
Not to worry, Harry. I'm about to fix your arm.
No, said Harry. I'll keep it like this, thanks. He tried to sit up, but the pain was terrible. He heard a familiar clicking noise nearby. I don't want a photo of this, Colin, he said loudly.
My back, Harry,
said Lockhart soothingly.
It's a simple charm. I need to count the sleeps.
Why can't I just go to the hospital wing? Said Harry through clenched teeth. He should really, Professor, said a muddy Wood, who couldn't help grinning even though his secret was injured. Great capture, Harry. Really spectacular. Your best yet, I'd say. Through the thicket of legs around him, Harry spotted Fred and George Weasley wrestling the rogue bludger into a box. It was still putting up a terrific fight.
Stand back,
said Lockhart, who was holding up his jade green sleeves. No, don't, said Harry weakly, but Lockhart was twirling his wand and a second later had directed it straight at Harry's arm. A strange and unpleasant sensation started at Harry's shoulder and spread all the way down to his fingertips. It felt as though his arm was being deflated. He didn't dare look at what was happening. He had shut his eyes, his face turned away from his arm, but his worst fears were realized as the people above him gasped and Colin Creevey began clicking away madly. His arm didn't hurt anymore, nor did it feel remotely like an arm. Said Lockhart.
Yes, well, that can sometimes happen. But the point is, the bones are no longer broken. That's the thing to bear in mind. So, Harry, just toddle up to the hospital way. Mrs. Granger, would you escort him? And Madame Pomfrey will be able to tighten you up a bit.
So Harry got to his feet. He felt strangely lopsided. Taking a deep breath, he looked down at his right side. What he saw nearly made him pass out again. Poking out of the end of his robes was what looked like a thick, flesh-colored rubber glove. He tried to move his fingers. Nothing happened. Lockhart hadn't mended Harry's bones. He had removed them. Madame Pomfrey wasn't at all pleased. "You should have come straight to me!" she raged, holding up the sad, limp remainder of what half an hour before had been a working arm. "I can mend bones in a second, but growing them back..." "You will be able to, won't you?" said Harry desperately. "I'll be able to, certainly, but it will be painful," said Madame Pomfrey grimly, throwing Harry a pair of pajamas. "You'll have to stay the night." Hermione waited outside the curtain drawn around Harry's bed while Ron helped him into his pajamas. It took a while to stuff the rubbery, boneless arm into his sleeve. "How can you stick up for Lockhart now, Hermione, eh?" Ron called through the curtain as he pulled Harry's limp finger through the cuff. "If Harry had wanted deboning, he would have asked." "Anyone can make a mistake," said Hermione. "And it doesn't hurt anymore, does it, Harry?" "No," said Harry, getting into bed. "But it doesn't do anything else either." As he swung himself onto the bed, his arm flapped pointlessly. Hermione and Madame Pomfrey came around the curtain. Madame Pomfrey was holding a large bottle of something labeled Skelegro. "You're in for a rough night," she said, pouring out a streaming beakerful and handing it to him. "Regrowing bones is a nasty business." So was taking Skelegro. It burned Harry's mouth and throat as it went down, making him cough and splutter. Still tut-tutting about dangerous sports and inept teachers, Madame Pomfrey retreated, leaving Ron and Hermione to help Harry gulp down some water. "We won, though," said Ron, a grin breaking across his face. "That was some catch you made. Malfoy's face, he looked ready to kill." "I wanted to know how he fixed that bludger," said Hermione darkly. "We can add that to the list of questions we'll ask him when we've taken the polyjuice potion," said Harry, sinking back onto his pillows. "I hope it tastes better than this stuff." "If it's got bits of Slytherins in it, you gotta be joking," said Ron. The door of the hospital wing burst open at that moment. Filthy and soaking wet, the rest of the Gryffindor team had arrived to see Harry.
"Unbelievable flying, Harry,"
said George.
"I've just seen Marcus Flint yelling at Malfoy. Something about having the snitch on top of his head and not noticing. Malfoy didn't seem too happy."
They had brought cakes, sweets, and bottles of pumpkin juice. They gathered around Harry's bed and were just getting started on what promised to be a good party when Madame Pomfrey came storming over, shouting, "This boy needs rest! He's got 33 bones to regrow! Out! Out!" And Harry was left alone, with nothing to distract him from the stabbing pains in his limp arm. Hours and hours later, Harry woke quite suddenly in the pitch blackness and gave a small yelp of pain. His arm now felt full of large splinters. For a second, he thought that was what had woken him up. Then, with a thrill of horror, he realized that someone was sponging his forehead in the dark. "Get off!" he said loudly, and then, "Dobby!" The house elf's goggling tennis ball eyes were peering at Harry through the darkness. A single tear was running down his long, pointed nose.
Harry Potter came back to school,
he whispered miserably.
Dobby warned and warned Harry Potter. Oh, sir, why didn't you heed Dobby? Why didn't Harry Potter go back home when he missed the train?
Harry heaved himself up on the pillows and pushed Dobby's sponge away. "What are you doing here?" he said. "And how did you know I missed the train?" Dobby's lip trembled, and Harry was seized by a sudden suspicion. "It was you," he said slowly. "You stopped the barrier from letting us through."
Indeed, yes, sir,
said Dobby, nodding his head vigorously, ears flapping.
Dobby hid and watched for Harry Potter, sealed the gateway, and Dobby had to iron his hands afterward.
He showed Harry 10 long bandaged fingers.
But Dobby didn't care, sir, for he thought Harry Potter was safe, and never did Dobby dream that Harry Potter would go to school another way.
He was rocking backward and forward, shaking his ugly head.
Dobby was so shocked when he heard Harry Potter was back at Hogwarts. He let his master's dinner burn. Such a flogging Dobby never had, sir.
Harry slumped back into his pillows. "You nearly got Ron and me expelled," he said fiercely. "You'd better get lost before my bones come back, Dobby, or I might strangle you." Dobby smiled weakly.
Dobby is used to death threats, sir. Dobby gets them 5 times a day at home.
He blew his nose on a corner of the filthy pillowcase he wore, looking so pathetic that Harry felt his anger ebb away in spite of himself. "Why do you wear that thing, Dobby?" he asked curiously.
This, sir?
said Dobby, plucking at the pillowcase.
"'Tis a mark of the house elves enslavement, sir. Dobby can only be freed if his masters present him with clothes, sir. The family is careful not to pass Dobby even a sock, sir, for then he would be free to leave their house forever."
Dobby mopped his bulging eyes and said suddenly,
"Harry Potter must go home." Dobby thought his bludger would be enough to make.
"Your bludger?" said Harry, anger rising once more. "What do you mean, your bludger? You made that bludger try and kill me?"
"Not kill you, sir, never kill you,"
said Dobby, shocked.
"Dobby wants to save Harry Potter's life. Better sent home, previously injured. Then remain here, sir. Dobby only wanted Harry Potter hurt enough to be sent home."
"Oh, is that all?" said Harry angrily. "I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you wanted me sent home in pieces?"
If Harry Potter only knew,"
Dobby groaned, more tears dripping onto his ragged pillowcase.
"If he knew what he means to us, to the lowly, the enslaved, we dregs of the magical world. Dobby remembers how it was when he who must not be named was at the height of his power, sir. We house elves were treated like vermin, sir. Of course Dobby is still treated like that, sir,"
he admitted, drying his face on the pillowcase.
"But mostly, sir, life has improved for my kind since you triumphed over he who must not be named. Harry Potter survived, and the Dark Lord's power was broken, and it was a new dawn, sir. And Harry Potter shall make a beacon of hope for those of us who thought the dark days would never end, sir. And now, at Hogwarts, terrible things are to happen, and perhaps happening already. And Dobby cannot let Harry Potter stay here now, and history is to repeat itself. Now that the Chamber of Secrets is to open once more."
Dobby froze, horror-struck, then grabbed Harry's water jug from his bedside table and cracked it over his own head, toppling out of sight. A second later, he crawled back onto the bed, cross-eyed, muttering,
"Bad Dobby, very bad Dobby."
"So there is a Chamber of Secrets?" Harry whispered. "And did you say it's been opened before? Tell me, Dobby." He seized the elf's bony wrist as Dobby's hand inched toward the water jug. "But I'm not Muggle-born. How can I be in danger from the chamber?"
Sir, ask no more, poor Dobby.
Stammered the elf, his eyes huge in the dark.
Dark deeds are planned in this place, but Harry Potter must not be here when they happen. Go home, Harry Potter, go home. Harry Potter must not meddle in this. 'Tis too dangerous.
Who is it, Dobby? Harry said, keeping a firm hold on Dobby's wrist to stop him from hitting himself with the water jug again. Who's opened it? Who opened it last time?
Dobby can't, sir. Dobby can't. Dobby mustn't tell.
Squealed the elf.
Go home, Harry Potter. Go home.
I'm not going anywhere, said Harry fiercely. One of my best friends is Muggle-born. She'll be first in line if the chamber really has been opened.
Harry Potter risks his own life for his friends,
moaned Dobby in a kind of miserable ecstasy.
So noble, so valiant, but he must save himself. He must. Harry Potter must not.
Dobby suddenly froze, his bat ears quivering. Harry heard it too. There were footsteps coming down the passageway outside.
Dobby must go,
breathed the elf, terrified. There was a loud crack, and Harry's fist was suddenly clenched on thin air. He slumped back into bed, his eyes on the dark doorway to the hospital wing as the footsteps grew nearer. Next moment, Dumbledore was backing into the dormitory, wearing a long, woolly dressing gown and a nightcap. He was carrying one end of what looked like a statue. Professor McGonagall appeared a second later, carrying its feet. Together, they heaved it onto a bed. "Get Madame Pomfrey," whispered Dumbledore, and Professor McGonagall hurried past the edge of Harry's bed out of sight. Harry lay quite still, pretending to be asleep. He heard urgent voices, and then Professor McGonagall swept back into view, closely followed by Madame Pomfrey, who was pulling a cardigan on over her nightdress. He heard a sharp intake of breath. "What happened?" Madame Pomfrey whispered to Dumbledore, bending over the statue on the bed. "Another attack," said Dumbledore. "Minerva found him on the stairs." "There was a bunch of grapes next to him," said Professor McGonagall. "We think he was trying to sneak up here to visit Potter." Harry's stomach gave a horrible lurch. Slowly and carefully, he raised himself a few inches so he could look at the statue on the bed. A ray of moonlight lay across its staring face. It was Colin Creevey. His eyes were wide and his hands were stuck up in front of him, holding his camera. "Petrified?" whispered Madame Pomfrey. "Yes," said Professor McGonagall. "But I shudder to think, if Albus hadn't been on the way downstairs for hot chocolate, who knows what might have..." The three of them stared down at Colin. Then, Dumbledore leaned forward and wrenched the camera out of Colin's rigid grip. "You don't think he managed to get a picture of his attacker?" said Professor McGonagall eagerly. Dumbledore didn't answer. He opened the back of the camera. "Good gracious!" said Madame Pomfrey. A jet of steam had hissed out of the camera. Harry, 3 beds away, caught the acrid smell of burnt plastic. "Melted," said Madame Pomfrey wonderingly. "All melted." "What does this mean, Albus?" Professor McGonagall asked urgently. "It means," said Professor Dumbledore, "that the Chamber of Secrets is indeed open again." Madame Pomfrey clapped a hand to her mouth. Professor McGonagall stared at Dumbledore. "But, Albus, surely, who?" "The question is not who," said Dumbledore, his eyes on Colin. "The question is, how?" And from what Harry could see of Professor McGonagall's shadowy face, she didn't understand this any better than he did. And that is the end of Chapter 10. I'd like to thank so much my special guests, Nick and Jorge, for returning. Fantastic job as always, guys.
Thanks. Thank you. I always love reading with you guys.
This was so fun. We experienced the return of Dobby, and we finally got a little bit of clarification as to why all these crazy things are happening to Harry. But stay tuned for Chapter 11 coming up soon, and we will hopefully continue solving this mystery. See you next time, and happy reading! Hi everyone, and welcome back to Mrs. Jones's reading of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. We left off on chapter 11, and I am so lucky to have back with me two very special guests. First, my mom calling all the way from Buffalo.
Well, hello. I am playing the esteemed Gilderoy Lockhart today, and I'm very happy to be here with my girls.
Wonderful. And my amazing sister calling in from Washington, D.C., Devin.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be playing Snape and Ernie today.
So we do have a new character today. We'll have to see what role Ernie plays in this chapter, and we also haven't heard from Snape in a little while, so we'll see what everyone is up to. You ready to get going, ladies?
Yeah, sure am.
All right, let's get started. Chapter 11, The Dueling Club. Harry woke up on Sunday morning to find the dormitory blazing with winter sunlight and his arm reboned but very stiff. He sat up quickly and looked over at Colin's bed, but it had been blocked from view by the high curtains Harry had changed behind yesterday. Seeing that he was awake, Madame Pomfrey came bustling over with a breakfast tray and then began bending and stretching his arm and fingers. "All in order," she said as he clumsily fed himself porridge left-handed. "When you've finished eating, you may leave." Harry dressed as quickly as he could and hurried off to Gryffindor Tower, desperate to tell Ron and Hermione about Colin and Dobby, but they weren't there. Harry left to look for them, wondering where they could have got to, and feeling slightly hurt that they weren't interested in whether he had his bones back or not. As Harry passed the library, Percy Weasley strolled out of it, looking in far better spirits than last time they'd met. "Oh, hello, Harry," he said. "Excellent flying yesterday. Really excellent. Gryffindor has just taken the lead for the House Cup. You earned 50 points. "You haven't seen Ron or Hermione, have you?" said Harry. "No, I haven't," said Percy, his smile fading. "I hope Ron's not in another girl's toilet." Harry forced a laugh, watched Percy walk out of sight, and then headed straight for Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. He couldn't see why Ron and Hermione would be in there again, but after making sure that neither Filch nor any prefects were around, he opened the door and heard their voices coming from a locked stall. "It's me," he said, closing the door behind him. There was a clunk, a splash, and a gasp from within the stall, and he saw Hermione's eye peering through the keyhole. "Harry," she said, "you gave us such a fright. Come in. How's your arm?" "Fine," said Harry, squeezing into the stall. An old cauldron was perched on the toilet, and a crackling from under the rim told Harry they had lit a fire beneath it. Conjuring up portable, waterproof fire was a specialty of Hermione's. "We'd have come to meet you, but we decided to get started on the Polyjuice potion," Ron explained as Harry, with difficulty, locked the stall again. "We've decided this is the safest place to hide it." Harry started to tell them about Colin, but Hermione interrupted. "We already know. We heard Professor McGonagall telling Professor Flitwick this morning. That's why we decided we'd better get going." "The sooner we get a confession out of Malfoy, the better," snarled Ron. "Do you know what I think? He was in such a foul temper after the Quidditch match, he took it out on Colin." "There's something else," said Harry, watching Hermione tearing bundles of knotgrass and throwing them into the potion. "Dobby came to visit me in the middle of the night." Ron and Hermione looked up, amazed. Harry told them everything Dobby had told him, or hadn't told him. Hermione and Ron listened with their mouths open. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened before?" Hermione said. "This settles it," said Ron in a triumphant voice. "Lucius Malfoy must have opened the chamber when he was at school. Here and now, he's told dear old Draco how to do it. It's obvious. Wish Dobby told you what kind of monster's in there, though. I want to know how come nobody's noticed it sneaking around the school." "Maybe it can make itself invisible," said Hermione, prodding leeches to the bottom of the cauldron. "Or maybe it can disguise itself, pretend to be a suit of armor or something. I've read about chameleon ghouls." "You read too much, Hermione," said Ron, pouring dead lace wings on top of the leeches. He crumpled up the empty lace wing bag and looked at Harry. So, Dobby stopped us from getting on the train and broke your arm. He shook his head. You know what, Harry? If he doesn't stop trying to save your life, he's going to kill you. The news that Colin Creevey had been attacked and was now lying as though dead in the hospital wing had spread through the entire school by Monday morning. The air was suddenly thick with rumor and suspicion. The first years were now moving around the castle in tight-knit groups, as though scared they would be attacked if they ventured forth alone. Ginny Weasley, who sat next to Colin Creevey in charms, was distraught, but Harry felt that Fred and George were going the wrong way about cheering her up. They were taking turns covering themselves with fur or boils and jumping out at her from behind statues. They only stopped when Percy, apoplectic with rage, told them he was going to write to Mrs. Weasley and tell her Ginny was having nightmares. Meanwhile, hidden from the teachers, a roaring trade in talismans, amulets, and other protective devices were sweeping the school. Neville Longbottom bought a large, evil-smelling green onion, a pointed purple crystal, and a rotting newt tail before the other Gryffindor boys pointed out that he was in no danger. He was a pureblood, and therefore unlikely to be attacked. They went for Filch first, Neville said, his round face fearful, and everyone knows I'm almost a squib. In the second week of December, Professor McGonagall came around as usual, collecting names of those who would be staying at school for Christmas. Harry, Ron, and Hermione signed her list. They had heard that Malfoy was staying, which struck them as very suspicious. The holidays would be the perfect time to use the Polyjuice Potion and try to worm a confession out of him. Unfortunately, the potion was only half finished. They still needed the bicorn horn and the boomslang skin, and the only place they were going to get them was from Snape's private stores. Harry privately felt he'd rather face Slytherin's legendary monster than let Snape catch him robbing his office. What we need, said Hermione briskly as Thursday afternoon's double potions lesson loomed nearer, is a diversion. Then one of us can sneak into Snape's office and take what we need. Harry and Ron looked at her nervously. I think I'd better do the actual stealing, Hermione continued in a matter-of-fact tone. You two will get expelled if you get into any more trouble, and I've got a clean record. So all you need to do is cause enough mayhem to keep Snape busy for 5 minutes or so. Harry smiled feebly. Deliberately causing mayhem in Snape's potions class was about as safe as poking a sleeping dragon in the eye. Potions lessons took place in one of the large dungeons. Thursday afternoon's lesson proceeded in the usual way. 20 cauldrons stood steaming between the wooden desks on which stood brass scales and jars of ingredients. Snape prowled through the fumes, making waspish remarks about the Gryffindor's work while the Slytherins sniggered appreciatively. Draco Malfoy, who was Snape's favorite student, kept flicking pufferfish eyes at Ron and Harry, who knew that if they retaliated, they would get detentions faster than you could say unfair. Harry's swelling solution was far too runny, but he had his mind on more important things. He was waiting for Hermione's signal, and he hardly listened as Snape paused to sneer at his watery potion. When Snape turned and walked off to bully Neville, Hermione caught Harry's eye and nodded. Harry ducked swiftly down behind his cauldron, pulled one of Fred's filibuster fireworks out of his pocket, and gave it a quick prod with his wand. The fireworks began to fizz and sputter. Knowing he had only seconds, Harry straightened up, took aim, and lobbed it into the air. It landed right on target in Goyle's cauldron. Goyle's potion exploded, showering the whole class. People shrieked as splashes of the swelling solution hit them. Malfoy got a faceful, and his nose began to swell like a balloon. Goyle blundered around, his hands over his eyes, which had expanded to the size of a dinner plate. Snape was trying to restore calm and find out what happened. Through the confusion, Harry saw Hermione slip quietly into Snape's office.
Silence! Silence!
Snape roared.
Anyone who has been splashed, come here for a deflating draft. When I find out who did this...
Harry tried not to laugh as he watched Malfoy hurry forward, his head drooping with the weight of a nose like a small melon. As half the class lumbered up to Snape's desk, some weighted down with arms like clubs, others unable to talk through gigantic puffed-up lips, Harry saw Hermione slide back into the dungeon, the front of her robes bulging. When everyone had taken a swig of antidote and the various swellings had subsided, Snape swept over to Goyle's cauldron and scooped out the twisted black remains of the firework. There was a sudden hush.
If I ever find out who threw this,
Snape whispered,
I shall make sure that this person is expelled.
Harry arranged his face into what he hoped was a puzzled expression. Snape was looking right at him, and the bell that rang 10 minutes later could not have been more welcome. He knew it was me, Harry told Ron and Hermione as they hurried back to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. I could tell. Hermione threw the new ingredients into the cauldron and began to stir feverishly. It'll be ready in 2 weeks, she said happily. Snape can't prove it was you, said Ron reassuringly to Harry. What can he do? Knowing Snape, something foul, said Harry as the potion frothed and bubbled. A week later, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were walking across the entrance hall when they saw a small knot of people gathered around the notice board, reading a piece of parchment that had just been pinned up. Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas beckoned them over, looking excited. They're starting a dueling club, said Seamus. First meeting tonight. I wouldn't mind dueling lessons. They might come in handy one of these days. What, you reckon Slytherin's monster can duel? Said Ron, but he, too, read the sign with interest. Could be useful, he said to Harry and Hermione as they went into dinner. Shall we go? Harry and Hermione were all for it, so at 8 o'clock that evening they hurried back to the Great Hall. The long dining tables had vanished, and a golden stage had appeared along one wall, lit by thousands of candles floating overhead. The ceiling was velvety black once more, and most of the school seemed to be packed beneath it, carrying their wand and looking excited. I wonder who will be teaching us, said Hermione as they edged into the chattering crowd. Someone told me Flitwick was a dueling champion when he was young. Maybe it'll be him. As long as it's not, Harry began, but he ended on a groan. Gilderoy Lockhart was walking onto the stage, resplendent in robes of deep plum and accompanied by none other than Snape, wearing his usual black. Lockhart waved an arm for silence and called,
Gather around, Can everyone see me? Can you all hear me? Excellent. Now, Professor Dumbledore has granted me permission to start this little dueling club, to train you all in case you ever need to defend yourselves, as I myself have done on countless occasions. For full details, see my published works. Let me introduce my assistant, Professor Snape,
said Lockhart, flashing a wide smile.
He tells me he knows a tiny little bit about dueling himself and has sportingly agreed to help me with a short demonstration before we begin. Now, I don't want any of you youngsters to worry. You'll still have your potions master when I'm through with him. Never fear.
Wouldn't it be good if they finish each other off? Ron muttered in Harry's ear. Snape's upper lip was curling. Harry wondered why Lockhart was still smiling. If Snape had been looking at him like that, he'd have been running as fast as he could in the opposite direction. Lockhart and Snape turned to face each other and bowed. At least, Lockhart did, with much twirling of his hands, whereas Snape jerked his head irritably. Then they raised their wands like swords in front of them.
As you see, we are holding our wands in the accepted combative position,
Lockhart told the silent crowd.
On the count of 3, we will cast our first spells. Neither of us will be aiming to kill, of course.
I wouldn't bet on that, Harry murmured, watching Snape baring his teeth.
1,
2, 3.
Both of them swung their wands above their heads and pointed them at their opponent. Snape cried,
Expelliarmus!
There was a dazzling flash of scarlet light, and Lockhart was blasted off his feet. He flew backward off the stage, smashed into the wall, and slid down it to sprawl on the floor. Malfoy and some of the other Slytherins cheered. Hermione was dancing on tiptoes. Do you think he's alright? She squealed through her fingers. Who cares? Said Harry and Ron together. Lockhart was getting unsteadily to his feet. His hat had fallen off, and his wavy hair was standing on end.
Well, there you have it,
he said, tottering back onto the platform.
That was a disarming charm. As you see, I've lost my wand. Ah, thank you, Miss Brown. Yes, an excellent idea to show them that, Professor Snape. But if you don't mind my saying so, it was very obvious what you were about to do. If I had wanted to stop you, it would have been only too easy. However, I feel it would be instructive to let them see.
Snape was looking murderous. Possibly Lockhart had noticed because he said,
Enough demonstrating. I'm going to come amongst you now, and I'll put you all into pairs. Professor Snape, if you'd like to help me.
They moved through the crowd, matching up partners. Lockhart teamed Neville with Justin Finch Fletchley, but Snape reached Harry and Ron first.
Time to split up the dream team, I think,
he sneered.
Weasley, you can partner Finnegan. Potter?
Harry moved automatically toward Hermione.
I don't think so,
said Snape, smiling coldly.
Mr. Malfoy, come over here. Let's see what you can make a famous Potter. And you, Miss Granger, you can partner with Miss Bulstrode.
Malfoy strutted over, smirking. Behind him walked a Slytherin girl who reminded Harry of a picture he'd seen in Holidays with Hags. She was large and square, and her heavy jaw jutted aggressively. Hermione gave her a weak smile, but she did not return.
Face your partners,
called Lockhart back on the platform.
And bow.
Harry and Malfoy barely inclined their heads, not taking their eyes off each other.
Wands at the ready,
shouted Lockhart.
When I count to 3, cast your charms to disarm your opponents. Only to disarm them. We don't want any accidents. 1, 2, 3.
Harry swung his wand high, but Malfoy had already started on 2. His spell hit Harry so hard he felt as though he'd been hit over the head with a saucepan. He stumbled, but everything still seemed to be working, and wasting no more time, Harry pointed his wand straight at Malfoy and shouted, Recta Sempra! A jet of silver light hit Malfoy in the stomach, and he doubled up, wheezing.
I said disarm only!
Lockhart shouted in alarm over the heads of the battling crowd as Malfoy sank to his knees. Harry had hit him with a tickling charm, and he could barely move for laughing. Harry hung back with a vague feeling it would be unsporting to bewitch Malfoy while he was on the floor. But this was a mistake. Gasping for breath, Malfoy pointed his wand at Harry's knees, choked, Tarantalagra! And the next second, Harry's legs began to jerk around, out of control in a kind of quick step.
Stop! Stop!
Screamed Lockhart, but Snape took charge.
Finite incatatum!
He shouted. Harry's feet stopped dancing, Malfoy stopped laughing, and they were able to look up. A haze of greenish smoke was hovering over the scene. Both Neville and Justin were lying on the floor, panting. Ron was holding up an ashen-faced Seamus, apologizing for whatever his broken wand had done. But Hermione and Millicent Bulstrode were still moving. Millicent had Hermione in a headlock, and Hermione was whimpering in pain. Both their wands lay forgotten on the floor. Harry leapt forward and pulled Millicent off. It was difficult. She was a lot bigger than he was.
Dear, dear,
said Lockhart, skittering through the crowd, looking at the aftermath of the duels.
Up you go, Macmillan. Careful, you. Pitch it hard. It'll stop bleeding in a second. Boop. I think I'd better teach you how to block unfriendly spells,
said Lockhart, standing flustered in the midst of the hall. He glanced at Snape, whose black eyes glinted, and looked quickly away.
Let's have a volunteer pair. Longbottom and Finch Fletchley, how about you?
A bad idea, Professor Lockhart,
said Snape, gliding over like a large and malevolent bat.
Longbottom causes devastation with the simplest spells. We'll be sending what's left of Finch Fletchley up to the hospital wing in a matchbox.
Neville's round, pink face went pinker.
How about William Potter?
said Snape with a twisted smile.
Excellent idea,
said Lockhart, gesturing Harry and Malfoy into the middle of the hall as the crowd backed away to give them room.
Now, Harry,
said Lockhart,
when Draco points his wand at you, you do this.
He raised his own wand, attempted a complicated sort of wiggling action, and dropped it. Snape smirked as Lockhart quickly picked it up, saying,
Whoops, my wand is a little overexcited.
Snape moved closer to Malfoy, bent down, and whispered something in his ear. Malfoy smirked, too. Harry looked up nervously at Lockhart and said, Professor, could you show me that blocking thing again? Scared, muttered Malfoy so that Lockhart couldn't hear him. You wish, said Harry out of the corner of his mouth. Lockhart cuffed Harry merrily on the shoulder.
Just do what I did, Harry.
What, drop my wand? But Lockhart wasn't listening.
3, 2, 1, go!
He shouted. Malfoy raised his wand quickly and bellowed, Serpensortia! The end of his wand exploded. Harry watched, aghast, as a long black snake shot out of it, fell heavily onto the floor between them, and raised itself, ready to strike. There were screams as the crowd backed swiftly away, clearing the floor.
Don't move, Potter,
said Snape lazily, clearly enjoying the sight of Harry standing motionless, eye to eye with the angry snake.
I'll get rid of it.
Allow me,
shouted Lockhart. He brandished his wand at the snake, and there was a loud bang. The snake, instead of vanishing, flew 10 feet into the air and fell back to the floor with a loud smack. Enraged, hissing furiously, it slithered straight towards Justin Finch Fletchley and raised itself again, fangs exposed, poised to strike. Harry wasn't sure what made him do it. He wasn't even aware of deciding to do it. All he knew was that his legs were carrying him forward as he thought he was on casters, and that he had shouted stupidly at the snake, "Leave him alone!" And miraculously, inexplicably, the snake slumped to the floor, docile as a thick, black garden hose, its eyes now on Harry. Harry felt the fear drain out of him. He knew the snake wouldn't attack anyone now, though how he knew it, he couldn't have explained. He looked up at Justin, grinning, expecting to see Justin looking relieved, or puzzled, or even grateful, but certainly not angry and scared. "What do you think you're playing at?" he shouted, and before Harry could say anything, Justin had turned and stormed out of the hall. Snape stepped forward, waved his wand, and the snake vanished in a small puff of black smoke. Snape, too, was looking at Harry in an unexpected way. It was a shrewd and calculating look, and Harry didn't like it. He was also dimly aware of an ominous muttering all around the walls. Then he felt a tugging on the back of his robes. "Come on," said Ron's voice in his ear. "Move, come on." Ron steered him out of the hall, Hermione hurrying alongside them. As they went through the doors, the people on either side drew away as though they were frightened of catching something. Harry didn't have a clue what was going on, and neither Ron nor Hermione explained anything until they dragged him all the way up to the empty Gryffindor common room. Then Ron pushed Harry into an armchair and said, "You're a parcel mouth. Why didn't you tell us?" "I'm a what?" said Harry. "A parcel mouth," said Ron. "You could talk to snakes." "I know," said Harry. "I mean, that's only the second time I've ever done it. I accidentally set a boa constrictor on my cousin Dudley at the zoo once. Long story. But it was telling me it had never seen Brazil, and I sort of set it free without meaning to. That was before I knew I was a wizard." "A boa constrictor told you it had never seen Brazil?" Ron repeated faintly. "So?" said Harry. "I bet a lot of people can do it." "Oh, no, they can't," said Ron. "It's not a very common gift. Harry, this is bad." "What's bad?" said Harry, starting to feel quite angry. "What's wrong with everyone? Listen, if I hadn't told that snake not to attack Justin..." "Oh, that's what you said to it?" "What do you mean? You were there. You heard me." "I heard you speaking parcel tongue," said Ron. "Snake language. You could have been saying anything. No wonder Justin panicked. You sounded like you were egging the snake on or something. It was creepy, you know. Harry gaped at him. I spoke a different language? But I didn't realize. How can I speak a language without knowing I can speak it? Ron shook his head. Both he and Hermione were looking as though someone had died. Harry couldn't see what was so terrible. Do you want to tell me what's wrong with stopping a massive snake biting off Justin's head? He said. What does it matter how I did it, as long as Justin doesn't have to join the headless hunt? It matters, said Hermione, speaking at last in a hushed voice, because being able to talk to snakes was what Salazar Slytherin was famous for. That's why the symbol of Slytherin House is a serpent. Harry's mouth fell open. Exactly, said Ron. And now the whole school's going to think you're his great-great-great-great-grandson or something. But I'm not, said Harry, with a panic he couldn't quite explain. You'll find that hard to prove, said Hermione. He lived about 1,000 years ago. For all we know, you could be. Harry lay awake for hours that night. Through a gap in the curtains around his four-poster, he watched snow starting to drift past the tower window and wondered, could he be a descendant of Salazar Slytherin? He didn't know anything about his father's family, after all. The Dursleys had always forbidden questions about his wizarding relatives. Quietly, Harry tried to say something in Parseltongue. The words wouldn't come. It seemed he had to be face to face with a snake to do it. But I'm in Gryffindor, Harry thought. The Sorting Hat wouldn't have put me in here if I had Slytherin blood. Ah, said a nasty little voice in his brain, but the Sorting Hat wanted to put you in Slytherin. Don't you remember? Harry turned over. He'd see Justin the next day in herbology, and he'd explain that he'd been calling the snake off, not egging it on, which, he thought angrily, pummeling his pillow, any fool should have realized. By next morning, however, the snow that had begun in the night had turned into a blizzard so thick that the last herbology lesson of the term was canceled. Professor Sprout wanted to fit socks and scarves on the mandrakes, a tricky operation she would entrust to no one else, now that it was so important for the mandrakes to grow quickly and revive Mrs. Norris and Colin Creevey. Harry fretted about this next to the fire in the Gryffindor common room, while Ron and Hermione used their time off to play a game of wizard chess. For heaven's sake, Harry, said Hermione, exasperated as one of Ron's bishops wrestled her knight off his horse and dragged him off the board. Go and find Justin if it's so important to you. So Harry got up and left through the portrait hole, wondering where Justin might be. The castle was darker than it usually was in daytime because of the thick, swirling gray snow at every window. Shivering, Harry walked past classrooms where lessons were taking place, catching snatches of what was happening within. Professor McGonagall was shouting at someone who, by the sound of it, had turned his friend into a badger. Resisting the urge to take a look, Harry walked on by, thinking that Justin might be using his free time to catch up on some work, and deciding to check the library first. A group of the Hufflepuffs who should have been in herbology were indeed sitting at the back of the library, but they didn't seem to be working. Between the long lines of high bookshelves, Harry could see that their heads were close together and they were having what looked like an absorbing conversation. He couldn't see whether Justin was among them. He was walking toward them when something of what they were saying met his ears, and he paused to listen, hidden in the invisibility section. So anyway, a stout boy was saying, I told Justin to hide up in our dormitory. I mean, to say, if Potter's marked him down as his next victim, it's best if he keeps a low profile for a while. Of course, Justin's been waiting for something like this to happen ever since he let slip to Potter he was Muggle-born. Justin actually told him he'd been down for Eton. That's not the kind of thing you bandy about with Slytherin's heir on the loose, is it? You definitely think it is Potter then, Ernie? Said a girl with blonde pigtails anxiously.
Hannah,
said the stout boy solemnly.
He's a Parselmouth. Everyone knows that's the mark of a dark wizard. Have you ever heard of a decent one who could talk to snakes? They're called Slytherin himself. They call Slytherin himself Serpent Tongue.
There was a heavy murmuring at this, and Ernie went on.
remember what was written on the wall? Enemies of the air beware. Potter had some sort of run-in with Filch. Next thing we know, Filch's cat attacked. The first year, Creevy was annoying Potter at the Quidditch match, taking pictures of him while he was lying in the mud. Next thing we know, Creevy's been attacked.
He always seems so nice, though, said Hannah uncertainly. And, well, he's the one who made you-know-who disappear. He can't be all bad, can he? Ernie lowered his voice mysteriously. The Hufflepuffs bent closer, and Harry edged nearer so that he could catch Ernie's words.
No one knows how he survived that attack by you-know-who. I mean to say, he was only a baby when it happened. He should have been blasted to smithereens. Only a really powerful dark wizard could have survived a curse like that.
He dropped his voice until it was barely more than a whisper and said,
That's probably why you-know-who wanted to kill him in the first place. Didn't want another Dark Lord competing with him. I wonder what other powers Potter's been hiding.
Harry couldn't take anymore. Clearing his throat loudly, he stepped out from behind the bookshelves. If he hadn't been feeling so angry, he would have found the sight that greeted him funny. Every one of the Hufflepuffs looked as though they had been petrified by the sight of him, and the color was draining out of Ernie's face. Hello, said Harry. I'm looking for Justin Finch Fletchley. The Hufflepuffs' worst fears had clearly been confirmed. They all looked fearfully at Ernie.
What do you want with him?
Said Ernie in a quavering voice. I wanted to tell him what really happened with that snake at the dueling club, said Harry. Ernie bit his white lips and then, taking a deep breath, said,
We were all there. We saw what happened.
Then you noticed that after I spoke to it, the snake backed off? Said Harry.
All I saw,
said Ernie stubbornly, though he was trembling as he spoke,
was you speaking Parseltongue and chasing the snake towards Justin.
I didn't chase it at him, Harry said, his voice shaking with anger. It didn't even touch him.
It was a very near miss,
said Ernie.
And in case you're getting ideas,
he added hastily,
I might tell you that you can trace my family back through 9 generations of witches and warlocks, and my blood's as pure as anyone's, so...
I don't care what sort of blood you've got, said Harry fiercely. Why would I want to attack Muggleborns?
I've heard you hate those muggles you live with,
said Ernie swiftly. It's not possible to live with the Dursleys and not hate them, said Harry. I'd like to see you try it. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the library, earning himself a reproving glare from Madame Pince, who was polishing the gilded cover of a large spellbook. Harry blundered up the corridor, barely noticing where he was going. He was in such a fury. The result was that he walked into something very large and solid, which knocked him backward onto the floor. Oh, hello, Hagrid, Harry said, looking up. Hagrid's face was entirely hidden by a woolly, snow-covered balaclava, and it couldn't possibly be anyone else, as he filled most of the corridor in his moleskin overcoat. A dead rooster was hanging from one of his massive, gloved hands. All right, Harry, he said, pulling up the balaclava so he could speak. Why aren't you in class? Cancelled, said Harry, getting up. What are you doing in here? Hagrid held up the limp rooster. Second one killed this term, he explained. It's either foxes or a blood-sucking bugbear, and I need the headmaster's permission to put charm around the hen coop. He peered more closely at Harry from under his thick, snow-flecked eyebrows. You sure you're all right? You look all hot and bothered. Harry couldn't bring himself to repeat what Ernie and the rest of the Hufflepuffs had been saying about him. It's nothing, he said. I'd better get going, Hagrid. It's Transfiguration next, and I've got to pick up my books. He walked off, his mind still full of what Ernie had said about him.
Justin's been waiting for something like this to happen ever since he's let slip to Potter he was Muggleborn.
Harry stamped up the stairs and turned along another corridor, which was particularly dark. The torches had been extinguished by a strong, icy draft that was blowing through a loose window pane. He was halfway down the passage when he tripped headlong over something lying on the floor. He turned to squint at what he'd fallen over and felt as though his stomach had dissolved. Justin Finch Fletchley was lying on the floor, rigid and cold, a look of shock frozen on his face, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. And that wasn't all. Next to him was another figure, the strangest sight Harry had ever seen. It was nearly headless Nick, no longer pearly white and transparent, but black and smoky, floating immobile and horizontal 6 inches off the floor. His head was half off, and his face wore an expression of shock identical to Justin's. Harry got to his feet, his breathing fast and shallow, his heart doing a kind of drum roll against his ribs. He looked wildly up and down the deserted corridor and saw a line of spiders scuttling as fast as they could away from the bodies. The only sounds were the muffled voices of teachers from the classes on either side. He could run, and no one would ever know he had been there. But he couldn't just leave them lying here. He had to get help. Would anyone believe he hadn't had anything to do with this? As he stood there, panicking, a door right next to him opened with a bang. Peeves the poltergeist came shooting out. "Why, it's Potty Wee Potter!" cackled Peeves, knocking Harry's glasses askew as he bounced past him. "What's Potter up to? Why is Potter lurking?" Peeves stopped, halfway through a mid-air somersault. Upside down, he spotted Justin and nearly headless Nick. He flipped the right way up, filled his lungs, and, before Harry could stop him, screamed, "Attack! Attack! Another attack! No mortal or ghost is safe! Run for your lives! Attack!" Crash, crash, crash. Door after door flew open along the corridor, and people flooded out. For several long minutes, there was a scene of such confusion that Justin was in danger of being squashed, and people kept standing in nearly headless Nick. Harry found himself pinned against the wall as the teachers shouted for quiet. Professor McGonagall came running, followed by her own class, one of whom still had black and white striped hair. She used her wand to set off a loud bang, which restored silence and ordered everyone back into their classes. No sooner had the scene cleared somewhat than Ernie the Hufflepuff arrived, panting on the scene.
"Not in the act!"
Ernie yelled, his face stark white, pointing his finger dramatically at Harry. "That will do, Macmillan," said Professor McGonagall sharply. Peeves was bobbing overhead, now grinning wickedly, surveying the scene. Peeves always loved chaos. As the teachers bent over Justin and nearly headless Nick, examining them, Peeves broke into song. "Oh, Potter, you rotter, oh, what you done? You're killing off students, you think it's good fun." "That's enough, Peeves," barked Professor McGonagall, and Peeves zoomed backward with his tongue out at Harry. Justin was carried up to the hospital wing by Professor Flitwick and Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department, but nobody seemed to know what to do for nearly headless Nick. In the end, Professor McGonagall conjured a large fan out of thin air, which she gave to Ernie with instructions to waft nearly headless Nick up the stairs. This Ernie did, fanning Nick along like a silent black hovercraft. This left Harry and Professor McGonagall alone together. "This way, Potter," she said. "Professor," said Harry at once. "I swear I didn't. This is out of my hands, Potter," said Professor McGonagall curtly. They marched in silence around a corner, and she stopped before a large and extremely ugly stone gargoyle. "Lemon drop," she said. This was evidently a password because the gargoyle sprang suddenly to life and hopped aside as the wall behind him split in two. Even full of dread for what was coming, Harry couldn't fail to be amazed. Behind the wall was a spiral staircase that was moving smoothly upward like an escalator. As he and Professor McGonagall stepped into it, Harry heard the wall thud closed behind them. They rose upward in circles, higher and higher, until at last, slightly dizzy, Harry saw a gleaming oak door ahead, with a brass knocker in the shape of a griffin. He knew now where he was being taken. This must be where Dumbledore lived. And that brings us to the end of chapter 11. I'm curious to hear what you all think, what is happening in this crazy school at this crazy time. I want to thank my special guests, my fam, my sister Devin, and my mom for joining me with Chapter 11.
Thank you for inviting, Zoe. It was really fun.
Thank you, Zoe.
Be safe.
As always, enjoy having you both, and for the rest of you, stay tuned for Chapter 12. Happy reading!
Through my online store alone, we've sold over $500,000 worth of spices. That's so crazy.
Hi everyone, Mrs. Jones here, welcoming